Now, I'd like to start with apologies for absence. Got apologies from Charlotte Blanche, who has a mandatory training course to attend today. Do I have any other apologies for absence?
I've not received any, no, Chair.
Right, thank you very much. We go on to declarations of interest. Does anybody have any interests that they need to declare? No, in which case, Chris, I'll hand over to you to respond to the Ofsted focus review. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. So the substantive item on the agenda is the feedback from the focused visit by Ofsted, which took place on the 6th to 8th of October. I think you will all have had a give the letter in the for the meeting. I'm not in absolute detail. I'm going to leave it for you to plenty of time for you to ask questions. There are a few things I want to pull out and stress about the visit. So the first of its kind in terms of a focused visit. In the past, we've had what's been called monitoring visits, which comprises of two inspectors.
Chris, you cut out briefly. I don't know if you could wind back 20 seconds. Chris, we still can't hear you. I assume it's a connection issue.
This was very different, and it felt like a very different experience. We had 5 inspectors. Okay, so
lost Chris, which is slightly upward. I don't suppose we've got Andrew Ireland here, have we?
Not as yet, no. Andy, I don't know whether you can pick anything up while Chris comes back online. Can you? Oh, Andrew Ireland has just come in.
Yeah, do you want me to just...
Yeah, that'd be brilliant, Andy. So Andy Dempsey will just pick up while Chris comes back in, Andrew.
Yes, that's fine. Andy, if I can invite you to speak in place of Chris, who we seem to have lost.
Yes, that's correct. We've been subject to a process of monitoring visits following the inspection in 2017. That involved really 2 inspectors spending 2 days on site with some prior work. The focus visit was a more extensive experience bringing us to an inspection. There were 4 Her Majesty's inspectors of social care, plus a schools inspector who spent days on site looking at the
Andy, we seem to have lost you again. Lost you.
Am I having the same problems that Chris is having?
Yes, you are, Andy. Slightly unfortunate. I'm not sure if you're both dialing in from the same location. Are you? I don't know if you're both at Shire Hall. Right. Okay. Well, what wonderful to hear that.
Give it another go, Andy, because we can hear you now.
Yeah, let's have another go. If it recurs, then we may have to move on to Andrew Ireland and come back to either yourself or Chris as and when one or other of you has connection.
Andrew, forgive me for interrupting, but I just wondered, if we can't hear Andy and Chris, which we can't, can they hear us, so that if we're asking questions, they will be able to, they will be, at least they can hear the questions and the debate.
I don't know the answer to that question. Can't be sure. I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn my video off in case that makes a difference to the bandwidth for anybody. But no, Andy, we don't seem to have connection with Andy. Andrew,
I'm listening, Chair.
you are listening.
I was just muted. Yeah, I just did put a thumbs up to show I could hear Leslie. Can people hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay.
Chris
I'll
seems to
take
be
it.
back.
Okay, I'll wait for Chris.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry about that. I think I fixed it.
Excellent. Oh, I can even see you.
You can even see me now, but I have taken my tie off.
You have taken your tie off, right? Well, I will take it on trust that you were wearing one. So if I can, so Andy sort of started coming in for you, but then we had some connections issues with Andy too. So perhaps you could resume where you left off, Chris.
Right, apologies for that. So this was a focus visit, very different from a monitoring visit that we'd experienced before. The monitoring visit comprised of 1.5 inspectors for 2 days. This was 5 inspectors focusing on us over a period of 2 weeks. We get notification. We have to provide a whole wedge of information called Annex A. They then go through that week 2 with a fine-tooth comb and generate key lines of inquiry from that evidence base. And then on the 3rd week, they visit the local authority. But of course, there was a mix of remote and face-to-face interviews. 2 of the 5 spent the whole week here, pretty much. And 3 of the 5 inspectors carried out interviews remotely. So it was very different. It felt very different. It felt like a full re-inspection. But of course, this was, although it was undertaken under the full ILACS framework, adapted for COVID, it wasn't what we call a judged visit. So we could be the best authority in the country, but we'd still be inadequate because part of this visit purpose wasn't to upgrade or downgrade. It was really to get a clear line of sight on the improvement journey. So we never expected that our rating would change as a consequence of this. As I said, we were very early in the cycle. This was a new process adapted for COVID, and we were the 2nd or 3rd authority to have been visited. So there was an element of it which was a bit like the blind leading the blind. I don't think the inspectors really had a clear view about what it was they were inspecting in terms of the education side of the business and how that related to children's social care and to the wider context of being amidst the biggest crisis this nation has faced since the Second World War. So that's why I think it was a kind of, we were a guinea pig in that respect. So that's why I say it was a bit like the blind leading the blind. You have the letter in front of you in the bundle. The bit I want to focus on really is the first part, the overview, to begin with. What was disappointing is that they started with the paragraph that they did. And actually, we get the opportunity to make suggestions for amendment. And we made 4 suggestions, 2 of which were wholly accepted, 1 of which was partially accepted, and 1 which wasn't accepted. And the one that wasn't accepted was to reorder these paragraphs in the overview. We wanted the second one to be the first paragraph, but that was the one they refused. So, and the reason for that is that the first paragraph really focuses largely on history. It makes reference to a legacy of poor decision making, and so it goes on poor assessments, plans that lacked focus, and lack of management grip, combined with historically high levels of staff turnover. Well, that is history. We're still on the road to improvement, but that is history. That is what they found when they inspected us, and probably for the next 2 years following inspection. But more recently, the body of the report is reporting on where we are now in real time. That's why we felt it was important that they didn't start with that paragraph, but they did. And you know, we just have to suck that up really and get on with it. Because I suppose, you know, they do start by saying that we're on the road to recovery. But it didn't, if you like, set the tone for what followed, because you will have read the letter and what followed is overwhelmingly positive. And the second paragraph relates to that. So they do acknowledge that there's been a real change in tempo over the last year or so, and that has been dependent upon new focus and energy, as well as decisions that were taken back 2 years or so ago around a whole range of issues. They also commend us for not having any drop-off in performance, in fact, continuing to improve during COVID and despite the circumstances that faced us. Children in need of help and protection had been seen regularly throughout, which was acknowledged. And that was largely on a face-to-face basis and in higher proportion than comparable authorities. In fact, our performance during COVID along a whole range of measures was among the best in the southwest of England, and we got acknowledgement for that. Similarly, our innovation and creativity, particularly in relation to developments like the virtual family court, which we set up within Shire Hall and then expanded to include a second virtual family court in Cheltenham. So families could still have their cases heard, still contribute to the process, even though the courts were closed to the public and operating virtually. So that was acknowledged again as something that we'd done, which was certainly commendable. The other thing that they complimented us for was not making use of the freedoms and flexibilities that government had introduced. We kept our standards and we operated by those standards. We didn't, if you like, take the route of least resistance and compromise those standards, even though legally we were able to do that. So that second paragraph in the overview, I think, is the critical one, which is the here and now. An inspection should focus on the last 6 months or so as well. So that first paragraph, again, going back to that, you can tell I'm irritated by it because I keep returning to it, you know, is about history. It's not about the last 6 months. The second paragraph is where we are now, much more so in my case. The third one goes on to say, quite rightly, and we do think this is a fair and balanced letter. The senior leadership team are happy with it. And it's true that we're under no illusion about the scale of change that we still face. We aren't where we want to be. We are not yet a good authority, but we're en route to getting there. And there's a few things that they pull out of that third paragraph and then list below in terms of those bullet points at the bottom of that page, where we need to continue to make quite significant improvements. And just to spend a little bit of time on those, one of the bullet points there is around pre-proceedings. And this is the process by which we go through to prepare cases for presentation to court, which is like a dress rehearsal, really, I suppose, to put it fairly basically or literally. And we have we did at the time of inspection have 97 families going through that process, comprising of 119 children. It's a process that we should complete within 26 weeks, and 32 families were over time, or 32 children, can't remember which. And I got summoned actually to see the lead inspector on the Wednesday lunchtime, and he expressed very serious concerns about those delays and the drift and delay that was occurring in the deciding long-term future of children. And that language is quite scary to somebody like me, because serious concerns mean that it's inadequate. So we took that very seriously. What we did is we, as a consequence of that, took every single case, every 32 cases, and we reviewed each file. We wrote a composite report. Social workers worked through the evening and into the small hours of the night to review those cases. Gail Hancock wrote a composite report, and we visited 2 families before 9:30 on the Thursday morning. And on Thursday morning at 9:30, when I had my keeping in touch meeting with the lead inspector, I was able to put that report on the table and say we've reviewed all 32 cases. None of those children have been left in unsafe circumstances, and I think they were very impressed with that. And the serious concern went away and was never mentioned again. However, it is an area of weakness that we're aware of. We were aware of it, but perhaps the degree of concern it caused among inspectors wasn't anticipated by us. I suppose that was the only failing. All these weaknesses that are bulleted at the bottom of the report have been identified by us, and there are plans in place to address those as well. So it wasn't a surprise to us. But I did think the way we responded to that, the agility by which we responded, and the commitment of the staff in producing that account of where we were with pre-proceedings, was partly the reason that they were less concerned about it. The other thing to say about pre-proceeding is it's not all down to us. You know, there's the availability of court time, and that's been reduced during COVID. And there's also the lack of availability of assessment by expert witnesses who haven't been as forthcoming during COVID either. But undoubtedly, some of it was a consequence of drift and delay and intervention by our own social workers. That was the main weakness, I think, and worry. But we had no cases presented, what we call Annex B cases, where they said you should visit this child is unsafe, you should make better arrangements. There were none of those, which was, again, reassuring. The second bullet point there, it refers to children on the edge of care, and our services for, I would describe 3 functions really. One is the progression of children into care in a timely way. The other is the maintenance of those placements when those placements look like they might be breaking down. And finally, the reunification of children back to families, or at least locally in geographic terms. So there's those 3 functions. We are reorganising our edge of care services that had already started when Ofsted visited. They acknowledged our plans, but of course that's very immature in terms of the outcomes yet that reorganised service is bringing forth. So again, we were aware of the weakness, we're doing something about it, but that just hasn't played through into outcomes for children and young people. Third bullet, number and choice of suitable placements. Again, we wrote our sufficiency strategy some 2 years ago, which acknowledged the fact that the market was weak, that we had to develop it and even intervene in it if we needed to. And we have done that. We've developed Travone House, which some of you have visited now. There's a fabulous provision for up to 21 young people. There's also other provisions within the capital programme to create further provision for young people as part of that sufficiency strategy. But it is also true to say that the market is still underdeveloped in the southwest and in Gloucestershire generally, and the number and choice of suitable placements for children isn't yet sufficient, and they pick that up. Consequently, if you don't have a good market, sometimes mistakes are made early on when you match a child to a placement. If that's not quite the right placement, then there's more chance of that placement breaking down. Or if the placement isn't sufficiently skilled and equipped to meet the needs of a complex young person, there's another reason why it might break down. So again, not something that was unfamiliar to us, something that we are beginning to address. But where we are now, it's a truism. There isn't sufficient suitable placements for our children and young people, which are of good enough quality or locally placed closer to Gloucestershire. And then personal education plans was an area which was also highlighted as a weakness. Although the virtual school got some very positive feedback from the schools themselves, we were asked to provide 6 personal education plans, or PEPs as we affectionately call them, and 2 which were supposedly good, 2 which were supposedly requiring improvement, and 2 which didn't meet the standard. In Ofsted's view, 5 out of the 6 never reached the standard. So clearly that is a weakness. And the main reason for that was that the clue is in the title. It's a personal education plan. And a lot of the plans for children in care reference behaviour and conduct issues, as well as a broader kind of therapeutic need, but doesn't specify achievement sufficiently within those plans in terms of our expectation of them educationally going forward. And they're right about that. We looked at those and they're right. So that was a weakness. And also, although it's not listed there, it is in the body of the report. The outcomes for children in care educationally still aren't as good as similar authorities if you compare the outcomes at Key Stage 4. So those were the 4 things that came across in the letter. There was a 5th during verbal feedback of repeat work. And by that, I mean children that bounce in and out of care, on and off of CP plans, in and out of child in need plans, etc. They're right again. You know, if you've got too much repeat work, that's a sign that you're not getting it right in the first place. So that was mentioned verbally. It's not reflected in the letter as a bullet point, but it is within the body of the report or the letter from Ofsted. The next 3.5 pages are a list of bullet points, which gives greater detail around the strengths and weaknesses yet to be addressed. And as I did with all of these letters, I highlight the negatives and the positives, and I look at the balance. And this letter contains far more yellow, which is positive, than pink, which is negative. That's very scientific analysis for you, but actually it works. And if you compare the letters over time, you can see that balance shifting to becoming much more yellow. And so I think what this means is, in summary, Chair, that this is probably a requires improvement script. And I'd say that if you take those 5 bullets of highlighted weakness, I would say it's squarely RI. But of course, those weaknesses exist. So there's still frailty in our recovery journey. But if we do address those 5 weaknesses, and I'm confident that we can, we've got an excellent team in place. We're all over these issues through the Accelerated Improvement Plan, and we now have sufficient capacity in children's social care with a successful transformation grant that we've just been notified of, which is in excess of £500,000 for additional capacity. I'd sit here pretty confident about achieving at least an RI in our full reinspection, whenever that might occur in the new year. Possibly spring at the earliest, but more likely, I guess, to be summer, given that Ofsted committed to doing 40 of these focused visits nationally before resuming the full reinspection of local authorities, which would be judged and lead to a change in those judgments. So I think that's a whistle-stop tour very quickly. I haven't gone through all the bullet points in the letter, but I'm sure there's a whole range of questions. And I know a couple of my colleagues are on the line. Andy's here, who played a full part in that, in fact, led on our preparation, and also Rob England as well, to talk about quality assurance, which they commented very, very positively about.
Thank you, Chris. And as you say, the letter would seem to indicate RI, but it is the most positive letter that I've seen from this authority since I joined. So I think you you are to be congratulated on getting to that stage. Now, I don't actually have any hands indicated to me, so I just thought I'd start, Chris, by asking you what a public law outline is. I gather it relates to proceedings, but it wasn't explicit. Oh, I've got a yes, and then if anybody else can indicate, I'll take names.
Yeah, so public law outline really is just the framework by which children's cases are brought to bear legally, and through the public sector. So it's where children are entering into public care. You've also got private proceedings, which is where disputes are resolved between mums and dads that go to court off their own back. Basically, it's as simple as that.
Okay, so just to summarise what you're saying, Ofsted is saying, they're saying it's simply we're not making as much use of efficient pre-proceedings to minimise presumably court time or delays. Is that what they're saying?
No, what they were saying is that there are timescales involved in us presenting a case, which we're not keeping to in a sufficient number of cases. Those 32 cases I referred to out of the 97 were over time. And of course, what that means is that you then get drift and delay in determining what the long-term arrangements are going to be for a child or young person. And that needs a resolution quickly. The quicker you can resolve that, the better for the young person. Otherwise, they're left wondering about where they're going to be living, who they're going to be living with, and under what circumstances. So it relates to us expediting those cases in a timely way and not allowing them to drift. And there is too much drift and delay in some of those cases. 32 of the 119 children or 97 families where that drift had been evident. But as I said, that's not all down to the decision making of social workers. Some of that is down to lack of court time, and some of it is down to lack of expert witnesses, which is often a prerequisite to progression.
Right, thank you, Chris. I've got Lorraine, Brian, and Bernie. So, Lorraine, can I invite you, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Chairman, and my apologies for being late. The thing locked me out and I had to phone up and get an unlock key, etc. Anyway, so this is for Chris. This is regarding I've lost the paragraph. Yeah, the rate of repeat referrals. This is something I've wondered about on occasion, not just to do with this letter. And I wonder, it cannot always be because the child has not received the correct help and etc. the first time round. It must have something to do with the situation that the child is living in, the parents, carers, whoever they may be. And that obviously creates difficulties. How do we go along with that? Because with the best will in the world, you try to get everything right for the child. If the child is staying in that situation, those parents, carers, whoever they may not want to oblige. So I'm assuming that at some point the child goes into care, or what? What is the situation there? Thank you.
So Lorraine, you're absolutely right, as usual, in terms of your assessment, and that is that we can't mitigate circumstances to the degree where you'd never have re-referrals. But nonetheless, it is an indicator of whether we've got it right first time or not. And the better our initial intervention, the fewer repeat referrals we would have. And we benchmark that performance indicator against similar authorities. And if you look at our performance against similar authorities, we are noticeable in that we have a higher rate of re-referrals against similar authorities in similar circumstances. So from that, we have to challenge ourselves and ask ourselves the question of why that is, and is it related to our first intervention not being as successful as it might be. And of course, the other thing is we're dealing with quite a legacy and history of referrals here in Gloucestershire. So if you've got families that have been referred before and it hasn't been successful, they're not as likely to engage with a subsequent intervention. You know, they think, well, what's the point? Social services were no use first time around. Why should I engage this time around? And so that adds as well to the complexity of the casework that we're having to manage. You know, we're managing that legacy every day in the work that we do. But, you know, it is an issue, and it's one that Ofsted highlighted, as you point out, and one that we're aware of and looking at very closely.
Thank you, Lorraine. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Great. Brian, could I bring you in there, please?
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay? Sounds like you can. I don't know. Okay, well, I'll carry on. If you can't hear me, I'll switch the video off. Let me know if you need me to. We are, 3.5 years since we first found out that Ofsted had recorded this authority as inadequate. And since that time, we've been on this relentless process of trying to improve. I think we've doubled our budget over that period. So we spent sort of tens of millions of pounds getting there. So when I read this letter, I think it is heartening that there's some good points in it. I went through the letter myself in the unscientific way that Chris had, putting some yellow and red highlighter pen over it to sort of pull out the goods and bads. And I must admit, I came out sort of fairly balanced on that. So, yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in this. And I think in particular what's good is that Ofsted recognise the steps that the management have taken to pull the service around. And I think that's really now quite clear. But there are some worrying things in there still. And one of the ones that I'm just going to focus on, because we could spend all day sort of going in and out and looking at different lines, is the insufficiency of provision to provide care. Because clearly, if we haven't got that, we can never do that. Now, obviously, we don't actually provide the care. We work with others, social foster carers and other service providers to deliver that care. But that, to me, is something I can't see we're going to change very quickly. It takes time. Trebone House taking a long time, but it almost feels like we could do with 2 of those before we've even got this one ready to open. And the number of foster carers, I think, has suffered during the COVID crisis, which is not that surprising. But the process of getting new foster carers on board has actually been quite difficult. I know we've worked hard. There's lots of campaigns to bring foster carers on, but I don't think the environment for foster care is particularly easy to work with. And I say that as a former foster carer, so I do know what it's like. And I think, therefore, I have concerns that we're going to struggle to actually bring that provision on in all its senses in a timely way. And it said if we're 3.5 years in from being found inadequate, if we are able to reach the scale of getting required improvement next time, say after 4 years, that doesn't feel like we're actually making the pace we need to. How long are we going to take to get to be a good service? Is that going to be 6 or 8 years? Just doesn't feel quite as pacey as I would like. And the other point I note, which I did refer to last week, so I'll just briefly cover, but I noticed the Chief Inspector of Schools has actually highlighted the concern we've raised previously at our committee meetings about children that are out of sight during the COVID crisis. And I just don't feel that we've done enough yet to make sure that we are identifying those children. I know the children are back in school, but I think it's very difficult for the schools to be delivering all of this additional support when they're actually struggling to provide a mainstream service in the current environment. And it just seems inevitable that children are going to slip through the unseen eyes of adults, of carers, of teachers. And at the end of the day, that means they're vulnerable. And we have a duty to try and fix that. So I think probably recognising the progress we've made, the task is we've got to up our game because the task has got harder. Thanks.
Could you respond to that, Chris?
Yeah. So Brian's right. You know, we should never be satisfied with where we are or with the pace we're achieving. You know, I never came to this job wanting to require improvement after 40 years in the job. You know, I came to this job to be a good service and to create a good service. And I know I'm like a broken record, but I say this every time. You know, when I first arrived, I said it's going to take 2 to 3 years to turn this authority around and get to a good RI, and probably another year or two to get to good. And those timescales are holding. Now, we're judged, as Brian says quite rightly, against the last time we were inspected, which was 2017, February 2017, I think. You know, I didn't arrive until March 18. People like Andy didn't arrive until August 18. And more recently, people like Gail Hancock have only been around for about a year now. And Wendy in AD for commissioning, Wendy Williams, has only been around for a couple of years as well. So the leadership team as currently formed has really only been working on this endeavour for about 2.5 years. And what's reassuring about the letter is they acknowledge some of those earlier decisions which Brian referred to, such as the setting up of the academy, such as the pipelines to create a more stable workforce. So that would include the recruitment from overseas of social workers, our frontline and step up programs, our funding of OU and apprenticeship routes into social services and social worker training, as well as the over recruitment of ASYEs and also boosting the numbers of students. All those pipelines had to be set up and, of course, begin to flow before you create a more stable workforce and achieve a more stable workforce on which you can land improvement initiatives. If, you know, what we were trying to do in the early months, while we still had a lot of churn, is try and land these improvements on a workforce that was continually shifting and moving on. So those improvements were difficult to make stick. Now we've got a stabilizing workforce. It's not stable yet, but we are down to 88 agency social workers now out of over 400, which is the lowest it's been since I've been here and since we were inspected. At one point, it was up to about 240 soon after I arrived, when we had that expansion of the service. Now it's down, as I say, now it's down to 88. And that will continue to stabilise as the ASYEs graduate and take up full caseloads. So that's what I mean. Those are just two examples of decisions that we took 2.5 years ago, as was the decision to create Travone House. You know, that took 2 years to deliver. Also in the pipeline, we've got plans for Southfields and Townsend House in Stroud, and a provision in Barnwood for mother and baby provision. So those are, as I say, all in the capital programme, and that impact on the market that we're seeking to achieve does take time as well to turn around. So, you know, there is no magic solution to change the quality of what we offer overnight, and we've been consistent about saying that, and it does take time to deliver. But I think now what you can gain confidence from this letter is that the pace of change is beginning to accelerate. You know, we're not at green shoots. We're not looking for a corner to turn. The green shoots have been and gone and are beginning to unfold, and the corners are being turned. So I think there is a clear line of sight now over the next 6 months to becoming an authority that is squarely RI with a confident future to become good. And that's consistent with the narrative that we've been presenting to you ever since I've been here anyway. So there are, clearly, Brian is right again. There are clearly services that are not as well developed as some others. Fostering is one of 4 that we have a very specific plan to address and improve. And we're currently opening that up to scrutiny externally from the LGA. We've got a sector leader reviewing our fostering service and the arrangements that we make to not just recruit foster carers, but offer quality training and sustain placements over greater lengths of time for young people. So I think fostering is, as I say, one of those 4 areas where we think we need to be doing a lot better. So I'm not sure whether that covered all of your questions, Brian. I think
the only bit you probably haven't covered, unless I wasn't listening properly, was about the children that are hidden from sight, which we're not.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, again, we are very worried about this, and I think I've said before on occasions, we've done some quite sophisticated predictive analytics on the impact of COVID. So we've tracked the number of contacts and referrals, which when we went into the first round of lockdown dipped dramatically, as you might suspect, because of course schools are one of our main referrers. So at points that dropped to 40% below what was expected on a month-by-month comparator to 12 months previous. It's back up to expected rates at the moment, but we're also expecting a bounce back because that reduction that we experienced back in March, April, May hasn't yet bounced back to a position where the contacts and referrals are above what you would expect to the same degree as that they were below back in April, May time. So we don't think, and the reason Brian raises this quite rightly is we don't think that children are safer because we've had less referrals and contacts. Actually, they're probably more at risk because teachers and schools generally haven't had eyes on to pick up these concerns. And I think as schools revert to normality, once vaccinations come online and they begin to get children in school full time, and they have a bit more space and time to talk to young people, what's been happening during lockdown may surface, and I think then we'll see that bounce back in referrals and contacts. Because out of sight doesn't mean to say they're not out of harm's way, and we do and have done some campaigns around not out of sight but not out of harm's way. We did a leaflet drop to every letterbox in the county. I did a couple of radio programs about the community needing to be our eyes and ears. So we're acutely aware of that risk that still exists within the system. And Brian's absolutely right to raise it.
Thanks. Can I just come back quickly? The steps that you took, the extra, the higher profile with the media, did that actually generate a different, an increased response? Do we know if that was effective? My question is.
I think, in all honesty, it's hard to tell. Sometimes, it may have prevented a reduction in referrals. You just don't know, really. But I think, as an authority, we did all we could to make certain that the community acted as our eyes and ears and did refer children if they felt that there was a concern about them. And as I say, we did that leaflet drop to every household in the county. So I'm not sure what else we could have done really over and above that, but whether it was effective or not, I think it's hard to tell, Brian, really, if I'm honest.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris and Brian. Bernie, and then I've got Richard Castle. If there's anyone else who wishes to speak, do raise your hands and Andrea will let me know. Bernie.
Yeah, thanks. Good morning all, and thank you, Chair. I still have great concerns because it does say in the opening paragraph, which as recently as February this year, the local authority's own audits demonstrate between 20 and 25% fail to meet basic minimum standards. That is a great concern. That's the minimum. The other thing is, I am also concerned that with the way we know our country is going, i.e. with unemployment rising, with poverty increasing, and that, there's going to be a bigger strain on the service, which means more children will be requiring support, because these are the things that bring on children needing support and care. And the real crunch question is, and I have my own opinion, which I will share with you, I don't think if we were Ofsteded now, we would pass. And that's nearly 4 years on. And if you look back before that, that's probably 8 years on. And for 8 years, we've been failing young people. Not a happy feeling for any of us. And it really concerns me. The point that somebody made about kids who were out of sight, this is a problem, because if children leave schools and we don't know where they've gone, this is when they're at the greatest danger. I won't recall, I have a very good case that my son involved in South London many years ago, and it was horrific. But we're going to get more pressure on the system, and I don't know whether we're in a position to withstand that.
Chris, if you could respond.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Bernard. So I think, without looking over our shoulders too much, it's important we don't forget history, but it's also important that we don't judge ourselves in terms of where we were 4 years ago, because we're in a very different place. I suppose an analogy might be, a football club that's been promoted to the Premier League, but is only mid-table, or maybe, in our case, if we're going to make it an accurate analogy, 1 or 2 places above the relegation zone. But 3 seasons ago, we'd have been in Division 1. We have been improving, we have been promoted, and we are doing better, but we're still a long way off the top 4 in the Champions League. And that's where we're aiming to be. And a lot of our performance indicators have been set against good and outstanding authorities, or against those top 4 football clubs, if we want to kind of extend that analogy. So I think you're right to remember that, but Andy did a very good report to the IB, and Andrew Ireland is here, and so is Andy, which described the distance travelled. And actually, it's a good read, and I'll tell you why it's a good read. It's a good read because it reminds you how far we've come, and what we've had to fix en route, and what we're continuing to have to fix to get us to good. I absolutely agree, Bernard, that we are not a good authority, but we're increasingly moving towards being a pretty sound authority in terms of getting into that RI space, and having a bit of breathing space. And I would hasten to add, if we maintain the current energy levels and rate of improvement, there might also be a couple of good features in that report when eventually we are re-inspected. So I think we are here heading towards an RI with 1 or 2, hopefully, good features. And I could talk about our QA process. I could talk about our performance systems that we've got. We know ourselves well. We know exactly what needs to be done, and we've got some strong elements of our service which I think are worthy of reference in any future inspection. In terms of the proportion of cases which are inadequate, they do reference last February, but we are in December. We're 10 months on, and again, that was partly the argument that we put forward to them to shift those paragraphs around, because the focus of an inspection should be the last 6 months, not the last 6 years, and or in this case the last 10 months. And if you look at the last 3 months of inadequate cases, we've had 5%, 17% and 8%, I think, if I remember correctly, but Andy and Rob England could correct me on that. But that was inadequate cases for September, October and November. So we are pretty consistently, if you take the average of those three, at or round about 10% now for the last quarter. And in any authority, my last authority, which inspected as good with outstanding features, had 8% inadequate casework. So you don't have to get to zero inadequate casework in order to be a good authority. But you have to have a sufficient system to identify and correct in inadequate casework where you come across it through the tools that you use to analyse it. So I would respond to that particular aspect of your question in that way. In terms of future pressures, absolutely spot on. Do you know, my biggest worry is youth unemployment at the minute, or one of my biggest worries. Since January 18, it's gone from just under 900 to 3,500 in Gloucestershire. It is shockingly difficult for young people to get purposeful employment now, and that's one of the reasons I'm taking a personal interest in pushing forward on the Kickstart programme, which is a programme designed to get young people into work. Vicky Walters has submitted a bid to the DfE for funding for that, and with a proposal to place over 200 young people in purposeful employment through that system. But even 200, compared to those figures I've just rehearsed with you, is a real worry, isn't it? Even if we get them, but you can only do what you can do, and ultimately the economy will be the fixer of that particular problem.
Thank you, Chris. Just picking up on that, so members are aware, there were 3 apprenticeships going to the company I work for, which I forwarded to I think it was Lynn Green or Dalla Keith, I can't remember, one of them, as a participation officer. I would commend, suggest to any of the councillors on this committee, if you do know of apprenticeships, do send them forward to Lynn or Della, who may be able to forward them on to the care leavers. So that's just a reminder for everyone on the committee. Can we move to Richard now?
Can I just come back on the employment, please?
Yeah.
It's not just youth unemployment, but it'll be parental unemployment as well, which will put enormous pressures on families, and both physical and mental. The cat's playing up, and things like that. And it really does concern me, because poverty is where a lot of this lies, and we're going to see more people falling into poverty. So we've got to be braced to accept more people into the system, not just youth unemployment, but their parents and young people in general. It's everybody saying it's going to be 2 million plus by summer 2021. I'm glad I'm not in the job market.
So, Chair, just there's some other quite good news around that particular issue as well, in that I'm sure colleagues on the board will have heard of the Troubled Families Programme. And the Troubled Families Programme is an area which Andy oversees. You want to ask him any details of that, I'm sure he'll give you the answers later on. But we perform pretty well as an authority in getting families back into work. That's one of the key indicators, Bernard, of a successful outcome, and it's a performance by results system. And we always, ever since I've been here, actually, it's been an element of a service that hasn't required fixing. It's always performed pretty well, relatively speaking. So, you know, something else to celebrate, really. That's a good service and it continues to be good. And the good news is that the government had just announced the continuation of that particular grant for 21-22.
Chris, I should have said, is the unemployment focused in a particular district within the county? For example, is Gloucester City the worst or the best, or how do they compare?
I don't know, Andrew, if I'm honest. I don't have the breakdown in my head, but we would have that breakdown if you want it. We can get it for you.
In that. Also, just to mention, obviously I'm from Gloucester, our own MP Richard Graham has been very much involved in promoting jobs fairs around the city. I don't know how that's worked virtually, but certainly pre-COVID he was very involved in that. I've got Richard Castle, then I've got Leslie who wants to speak, and I think Andrew Ireland wanted to just ask a question before he himself will go on to present his own improvement report. Richard.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you as well, Chris, for your going through the Ofsted report. I have to say I do disagree with you in terms of the overview and that first paragraph, because I think those of us that were here sitting around the table figuratively 4 years ago will recall exactly where we were. And one thing I looked for immediately out of that was trust, transparency and improvement. And in my view, there's ample evidence of that. So while I'll hold congratulations until we have it in black and white from Ofsted, I do look at this as a positive way forward, and thank you for it. Can I raise one point, though, which you mentioned briefly in your introduction, personal educational plans. And this, of course, follows very much the conversation you've just had, because if we don't give young people a decent education, and if they've had a rocky start in life at any rate, then actually not having a good education is going to put them at even more of a disadvantage, which is a given. I'm familiar with PEPs, and I'm slightly surprised that this has come up as an issue because they are relatively straightforward to put together. What I'm wondering is if you've got any thoughts at all on where the failing lies, for want of a better word of using it, of coming up with it. Is this a question of the social workers unaware of what they need to do, which I doubt because it's very straightforward, or is it more a resource issue within the education sector within Gloucestershire County Council? And I mention that because I know there's a well-rehearsed lack of educational psychologists who'd obviously come into play, although the situation is improving. But perhaps moreover, looking at the current situation, I mean, I've got a case at the primary school I'm chair of governors of, with a child who's in desperate straits, and I can't get anything meaningful or any senior level traction out of the education department. Thank you.
Yeah, so a good challenge, Richard. I mean, primarily the responsibility of producing the PEP is the school's responsibility. But of course, that should be encouraged and supported and challenged by input from the virtual school primarily, and also if there is a care element, the social worker, and the social worker should be involved in oversight of that PEP. But primarily it's for the school to draw up. So I think the task is for the local authority to be able to provide the right blueprint and the right emphasis for those plans, and to offer training possibly through the DSL network in a way which will uplift the quality of those plans and give a sharper focus to achievement. Don't forget what I said, and what the inspector said to me very clearly was, look, you're doing well in terms of most of these children who require a PEP have now got a PEP. Back in 2017, a lot of them didn't even have a PEP. And now they've got one, it's the quality issue and the focus on education that's the issue. They think that there's too much, not too much of a focus. They focus on the care of the child and the child's behaviour, that kind of thing, and the care arrangements. But that's not equaled by an equal focus on achievement. And that's the particular egg we've got to crack going forward, I think, over the next few months.
Thank you, Chris. Leslie.
Thank you very much. And I too go through the letter, marking it with 2 highlighters to see, because I think it's a good system. Thank you very much, Richard. And then I go back and I give ticks and crosses, and I think there were more ticks and crosses. But I sort of am sitting here feeling slightly irritated that that there are. First of all, I think we should say thank you very much to everybody who's working within children's services, who is, because they need thanks. You know, it's tough to be having to work through all this, and they need support, and they need support from us, and they need recognition that it took a long time to get to where the Ofsted recognised what was happening in February 17. So it's going to take a long time to turn it round. And I think we should also think back about the fact that those of us who've been on the council for some years have sat by and watched while central government enforced cuts on local government, and they enforced cuts, and those cuts meant we saw children's centres change. Anybody who's read any reports about how Sure Start works will see that Sure Start was an incredibly effective system, and that's gone, and the children's centres changed. And I'm probably very boring about how important I think the early years are, so we'll go past them. But there was, for some time within this council, and we all sat by and watched while we saw cuts, we saw services changing shape to allow the cuts, and therefore we should have expected, if we had any thought that things would go wrong. We had a social workers working group some years ago because there were we recognised there were problems with social workers and the lack of, and we knew that there were more agency social workers, and so there was an investment of cash that year. We had a working group looking at how do we look after young people who've got complex problems, because there is nowhere in the county, or there had to be nowhere in the county, where you could actually look after young people who are on the edge and possibly having a section order placed on them. And we all sat by and we watched that. So we do have to take some responsibility for all this. And we also have to take some responsibility that nobody had any vision for what was actually needed in the county to support our young people. We didn't, you know, were we pressing the administration to say, come on, administration, you're giving grants to particular areas of adult care, how about some for children? No, we didn't. And central government and the administration had to take some part in this, and currently they have. Brian has commented on the level of investment that's gone into children's services. It's there because it was needed. It's not there because it's, you know, it's a nice to have. It was there because the service over the years had been failing our young people, because there'd been a lack of vision for what was needed and a lack of investment. So I think we should acknowledge that this letter is a sign that things are getting better. And to be carping about certain things, I think is unfair on people who are doing all they can to get things turned around. We should be actually making our concerns known to the administration and to central government, to say, you are letting your children down. It's recognised at the LGA board. We've been letting our children down. We see more problems with mental health, and all of this we know, and it is to be expected, because if the services aren't there to do the supporting and to do what's needed, it will happen. So I say thank you very much, Chris, and all your staff for what they're doing. This letter is a letter of encouragement. And I think we should yes, we do need to perpetually keep a weather eye on things, but we do also need to remember how far we've come, but why we got there in the first place. And I think for me, the most important thing probably is that the insights into what is needed is acknowledged in the letter. The Ofsted people realise that GCC, officers within GCC, know what has to be done to get there. And we all need to actually be there as critical friends, but also to support. Thank you very much. And I was interested to hear the Inspector of Schools saying what about the hidden children, because it had been brought up before, and the you know, I can't remember what the slogan was that got used, but just that's been known about. So GCC have been doing what they should be doing. So if we're going to be critical, we should be critical towards central government for a total lack of investment in the important area, which is children's services. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. And certainly what I think we could all agree with is that we should say thank you to everyone who's working in children's social services. We seem to have a unanimity, at least from the chair and vice chair, Chris. So do object, members of the committee, if you disagree with me. But would it be possible for you to take that back to the whole of your department, Chris, and pass on the thanks from this committee? Before I go on to getting a response from you to Leslie's question, though, can I just bring in Richard Boyle? Richard, did you have any responses to Leslie's comments that you wanted to make?
Forgive me for interrupting, but what I forgot to mention was exclusions. The numbers of exclusions, which was another working group. It would be helpful, I think, if alongside this work that's going on, could we have an update on exclusions in the county at some point, please?
That's an excellent idea, Leslie. Andrea, could you add that to the work plan, the future work plan? I believe I saw some more recent figures a while back, which suggested that the permanent exclusions were coming down, but I think we could certainly do with a full report on that. Thank you, Leslie, for that. Richard, could I just bring you in before Chris responds?
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to thank everyone who's spoken this morning. There's been some really good questions and some analysis of the Ofsted letter. The only thing that I can add really is that when you look at counties like Essex, and Chris will be able to give you the number of years it took them to turn around, big authorities like ours that have found themselves mired in poor practice are difficult to shift. And we've been working really hard to make sure that we put in place all the support that staff need to improve their practice and to set a standard for Gloucestershire social workers. And, as Chris has said, we have turned some of those corners. And we are now on a trajectory and at a pace that is going to increase and will make the difference to get us well over that line and into a much better place for looking after our young people. But it does take time to turn around services, and other large authorities in this country have met the same challenges. And I think Essex, I think it was 6, maybe 8 years before they were where they are now. And but Chris will be able to confirm that. So it's part of a long journey. We would want it to be shorter always, but we have to recognise the pace at which we can change and the areas that have got to be tackled along that journey are really difficult to manage. So I'll just let Chris give you the time frame for other large authorities.
If you could come in on this, I suppose I could be cheeky and ask how long you think it would be before we can get to good as an authority, but I'll leave that to you, Chris.
Well, thank you. In terms of Essex, if you speak to Helen Lincoln, the person in my role in Essex, she says it took them 5 years to get to good and another 5 years to get to outstanding. So we're ahead of schedule, if that's the case. Certainly since we marshalled the current team, if you go back to February 17, we're about on pace now, I think. And as long as we maintain that momentum, I think, we will get up to and ahead of the curve. But, the positive commentary is very welcomed. And I will pass that on. And there's a couple of staff here who will have heard it. And I'm sure they'll pass it on. But, going back to Leslie and Richard's comments, they're right. We're under no illusion here as a senior leadership team that there's still a long way to go. But at least now there's some acknowledgement that going in the right direction and we're beginning to pick up pace and we're doing the right things, which are beginning to have outcomes for children and young people. So, we're not where we want to be, but we're heading now en route to where we want to be. And I see no serious impediments to that if we can keep the team together. And we do have sufficient resource now. It's unusual that you hear somebody like me say that because we can always do with more. But and I, it's not my role to analyse history, and I'm not going to. All I can say is, as I sit here, I feel blessed in many ways. One, that I think I've got sufficient resource to do what we need to do to get to good. Two, I think we get great cross-party political support. And that's not flannel to you guys. Those that you know me well will know that I'll say what I think. But I think this is probably the best authority that I've ever worked in terms of cross-party support. Children's Services isn't used as a political football, as it has been in some other authorities, certainly not to the degree that it has in some other authorities where I've worked. And I also get good corporate support from my colleagues in the corporate leadership team as well, from across the council. So, you know, there are no major impediments, as I see them, to getting to good. It's just hard work and a long slog, because, as Richard says, turning around a large county with that legacy of failure is a difficult challenge. And it's probably, if I'm honest, turned out to be a bit more difficult than I anticipated as well. You know, I knew it was going to be difficult, but it's probably a bit more difficult than I thought it would be as well. It's the biggest challenge that I've ever had. But I am, after this visit, in a much more confident place, and I know that Andy is, he's told me, Gail is, and Wendy, other members of the leadership team, are much more comfortable now, having had that visit and confirmation that we are heading in the right direction. And it's your role as Scrutiny to make certain that you keep cracking the whip, and I'd expect you to do that.
Just in terms of thinking ahead to good, are we on a trajectory that can get to good? And how long do you think it might be before we could get there?
Well, of course, getting to good is dependent upon inspection, isn't it? So you only get an opportunity to be categorised as good when you're inspected. So our first opportunity will be in the new year, when they come to inspect us fully under the ILACS framework, which is a judged visit. If it comes in the spring, I would say that's too early for us to be good. Even I think if it was summer, that's probably too early for us to be good. But I think if it's anywhere between those 2 points in time, I do clearly expect to be solidly RI with a couple of good features. That would be my ambition. I don't think that's la la land. I don't think I'm deluded in saying that. I think if I look at what we're doing now and the quality of what we're doing and how quickly it's improving, I think if we can address those 4 or 5 bullet points, we will be squarely RI. Beyond that, Chair, it depends, you know, I think we could be operating as a good authority within 2 years, maybe sooner, but you won't get that recategorization until you're re-inspected again, which, you know, we don't know when that will be. It probably could be another 3 or 4 years off. So we are dependent on that. But what's important, isn't it, is that you've got the intelligence in terms of your management oversight to know that you're good. Because what's important is that children and young people receive a good service, not whether it's called good by Ofsted. I couldn't give a monkey's what Ofsted thinks in some respects, other than it impacts on our lives dramatically. But that's the key thing. Children and young people have got to have a good service, and I think we can get there within a couple of years.
Good. Well, thank you very much for that, Chris. And you know, we all appreciate the amount of work you personally have put into getting us to where we are at the moment. Andrew, I know that you were going to speak, but then changed your mind and decided that you would make your comments during your substantive item. We've come to that, so it's over to you.
Thank you, Chair. So you have my most recent report to the board, which was last met on the cusp of the Ofsted letter becoming public, but just before. So board members at the time didn't have the full version that you have now. But clearly, the last two meetings have been in the context of some knowledge of the outcome of that focused visit, and for all the reasons that Chris has already said, that's the most substantive and detailed look at the work of going on in the service. Well, really since 2017, we've had a series of regular visits, but they're not gone into the depth of detail that this most recent one has. And the point I was going to come in on was related to Councillor Fisher's point when he was referring back to the February audit figures. And I would have agreed with him in February with that kind of information still, that it would be very much in the balance had an inspection come at that point. It would have been a very much closer thing if as to whether we would have crossed the line, and if we had probably only just crossed the line into requires improvement. So therefore, I think in the period between February to October, the outcome of this visit does demonstrate significant increase in pace and progress that's occurred in the intervening period. And I think the interesting thing at the moment is that we have a number of external or semi-external commentators having an analysis, having a view, of which Ofsted's is clearly the most important and relevant, but includes myself and the DFE and others working on specific areas. And there's a very significant degree of consistency of view. And it does, it is also consistent with the senior leadership team's own view. So I think there is something in that which can give us some a level of confidence. Not that I'd ever suggest you wouldn't have a level of confidence in what Ofsted have written, but their findings are very much in line from their more detailed look with the kind of analysis that I would have, I know Chris has, and the DFE have. And that has shifted considerably during the course of 2020 and to this point. And I would agree with Chris's analysis as well, that by and large this would reflect requires improvement, and that significant movement on the issues that Ofsted have identified should take the authority into assuming we're looking at something like a 6-month window before inspection, should take us solidly into should take us into a solid RI judgment if that progress is achieved. So in terms of the improvement board, we've clearly been tracking this over the period since I last reported, using consistently the performance data and the quality assurance reports that Rob England will be talking about. Excuse me, looking at some specific areas along the way and backed up by other work that I'm doing to bring. And you can see in paragraph 2 of my report, just over the previous couple of months, sort of activity beyond the board meetings that I've been engaging in terms of building up, continuing to build up intelligence, some contact with frontline through meetings like this one. So I've not actually set foot in the county since February, I don't think, which is less than ideal, but the technology has provided the opportunity to keep the program of work going and the discussions with senior managers and meetings with teams and with others. So that's all there for you to see. I don't obviously take questions, but I won't take up a lot of time on that. You can see through the analysis that it's clearly the focus visit from Ofsted is of huge importance. But my work as well would have suggested that the trajectory that I had indicated to you at the last time, your last meeting at which I was on the agenda and moving in the right direction, has continued firmly, and indeed additional capacity, some of which is well known to me, people who work with me in my previous authority, has been added, and I'm very confident will continue to add significant value all the way through this process. And the fact that the DFE bid has been successful, I think, is a very positive indicator. So in terms of the analysis, as I said, there is a huge level of consistency now in everybody's analysis of where the authority is and the pace that it's moving forward, and that the direction of travel is very much in the right place, in the right direction. But I would draw attention. I think that and I made the point that the identification of these specific issues, all of which are ones that we have focused on in the board, around drift and delay, around children on the edge of care, and around placements and placement stability, the subtly often I think is subtly shifting the agenda away or beyond just pure compliance. So perhaps be a good example, and Chris's answer is a good example. We're not now just talking about do all the children who should have PEPs have one. We're now talking about, are they of any value? Are they of any quality? And the same with the other issues. It's focusing more on the outcomes for the children and young people, rather than just compliance and being able to prove that all the right steps have been done. And I think that is a subtle shift. It's always what Ofsted would say we were measured against, quite rightly. But inevitably, at earlier stages in the improvement journey, and I recognise this from my own, you focus on compliance, getting people to do the things they are supposed to do, but they can't be tripped up on not having done. But we're moving on from that. So the expectation, really, that for the inspection, we should be able to demonstrate more in the way of outcomes and not just compliance, I think is kind of underlies some of these comments and the verbal feedback comments. And indeed, I was interviewed myself by the lead inspector, some of the sort of tone and where he was getting at in some of his questioning. However, I think that, I've said in my report, I'm very confident that the senior leadership team are totally aware of this. I'm not providing some devastating revelation they've not thought of in these comments. They are across that, and I know from my regular conversations with them all that that's exactly where they are as well. And the steps that have been taken around advanced practitioners and some of the particular focused work the improvement team in areas around planning and analysis are all geared to that end. So I think I have some confidence, the board has some confidence that the emphasis is right, allied to a real drive for the pace that's required. And I think also Ofsted were two more points. One, they were very complimentary about the quality assurance work that goes on, and Rob will be, and Andy can talk about that. And you see that's on later on your agenda. It's very important to the board, and it's developing all the time. So that is a positive, strong positive. So, you know, that's, and the second point is, I think it seems clear that your social workers, by and large, gave a reasonably good account of themselves to the inspectors, and that's really important. That you have social workers who can demonstrate they know the children, know their cases well, and are confident in talking to third parties, particularly inspectors, because of the inevitable dynamic of that, about what they're doing and why. And I think, although clearly there were issues, and Chris has alluded to them, that arose during that, they were clearly dealt with. And as I understand it, and Chris will correct me if I'm wrong, there were no cases of really serious and urgent concern were brought to the senior manager's attention through that visit. So there are areas to be encouraged from. So I think my final judgment, and to the board, is that we are seeing now in action, and Ofsted have seen, some of the fruits of what I've been trying to convey to the board for a number of months now, having spent some time saying pace isn't quick enough, you know, and then saying we're now seeing some evidence of a change of pace and drive. I think we're now seeing some evidence of outcomes following from that, and Ofsted have seen some of that in this focused visit. So I would agree with Chris's overall judgment about what this letter is saying, and I think the board also accepted Chris's analysis. There's no scope for taking the eye off the ball, the foot off the pedal, whichever analogy you like. It's so easy to slip backwards, and Councillor Fisher again is right to point up that there are potential demand issues coming along the track, but there have been potential demand issues when schools went back after the lockdown, first lockdown, and other points along the way, you know, they've been coped with. And I think the fact that Ofsted have been taken a positive view about how the authority has coped and adjusted its work in the pandemic is a good sign in terms of Ofsted's overall view. And secondly, actually some agility and fleetness of foot on the part of the senior leadership team, backed up, I think, by the rest of the council, to be able to do that. And my interactions with frontline staff have suggested that in the majority of cases, staff are comfortable and confident and recognising that communication is good, and feeling the authority is doing a good job in trying to support them working in extraordinary circumstances. So I'll stop there, Chair, and happy to deal with any questions.
Well, thank you very much for that, Andrew. It's good to get extra kind of reassurance about where we are. And Andrew, I don't actually have any indications from you on any questions. So I think it remains for me just to thank you very much for that, Andrew. I'm sorry you haven't been able to get to the county in person, but I'm sure that your virtual scrutiny of what's going on has been just as effective. So thank you very much for that. The next agenda item is quality assurance. Do we have Rob England on the line, Andrea? We do. Excellent, good. In which case I will pass straight over to Rob. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And with permission, Chair, if I may continue without my camera on, just to preserve the signal. and to check if colleagues can hear me.
I can hear you clearly, Rob, and it's perfectly acceptable to present without the video if you're concerned about bandwidth.
Wonderful, thank you. Much of what I have to add, I think, has largely been covered by colleagues already. But if I may touch on a number of the subjects in greater depth, but then also open up opportunities for questions or conversation as needed. But I would like to come back to some of the observations and queries posed by Councillors Fisher, Robinson, Castle, and others, some of the points made by Chris and Andrew thus far, where it's very rightly been picked up on our trajectory for improvement, and where there was previously lacking pace, where there has recently been an increase in pace and direction. I would agree with Chris that unequivocally in the last 3 months there is strong evidence to suggest improvement, and certainly improvement that is reaching towards our target levels around the rate of inadequate practice in the authority, which is very encouraging. But if I may just take a backward step to think about our history, not over long, but just to demonstrate where we are at present. And the reason I'd like to do that is a little under 2 years ago, when I came into this post, and I attended one of my first committee meetings, committee members challenged officers and put a charge to us as officers that following the experience of 2017, you would need from us an honest and reliable self-evaluation on an ongoing basis, so that there was no opportunity to be caught unawares in the future. And I'm pleased to say that according to the regulator, not just in this latest visit, but in visits previous to that, they've by and large reinforced the viability of our quality assurance and performance framework, which is good to hear. But what we know from that framework is that a little over 22 months ago, we had some very, very intractable poor practice in the authority. And if I can just be a little bit technical about QA and Ofsted grade descriptors for a moment, the inspection framework as was, under the CEF single inspection framework, almost had 2 grade descriptors for inadequate practice. There was the kind that we've heard Andrew Ireland suggest, which is immediate concerns that require an urgent response, same day or within 24 hours, to secure the safety of a child. And a second classification, which would have been practice that was generally very weak and substandard, but didn't necessarily constitute an acute response. What we've seen over the last 22 months is a marked reduction in the kind of practice that would leave us worried about the safety of a child. And so if I can share an analogy or a metaphor of a toothpaste tube, it's that we are pushing practice up the toothpaste tube. So rather than just randomly squeezing the tube, there is evidence over the last 22 months of us pushing that practice up the tube. So we only infrequently now come across instances where we are immediately concerned for the safety of a child, whereas quite regularly that was the case 22 months ago or before. We also can now see latterly that the instance of weak practice or inadequate practice has reduced, as Chris says, 5, 17 and 8% respectively. And so that inadequate practice is being pushed steadily up into the bounds of RI, requires improvement practice. But to be more specific, in that realm of RI, we would see quite a lot of that practice still being deemed quite weak. So we're not yet solidly RI. We are in the realms of RI on our latest data, but not yet securely so. So this remains a pivotal point that really calls on the authority to maintain the momentum and the pace and the grip that it's been demonstrating thus far, which, if I may say, is no mean feat. It has been a sustained push. Colleagues have mentioned that already today. We do need to be mindful of fatigue in the system, and we cannot ignore the impact of COVID in the current circumstances, not just in terms of fatigue, but also the constraints that places on practice. In addition to which, what we can see in our more recent practice is far higher compliance levels, which Andrew has touched on. that we are now seeing compliance of practice, which allows us to then assess the quality of the practice that is there. Whereas 22 months ago, very regularly, we just couldn't see the practice that was expected. And again, I'd like to connect that compliance to circumstance, because it's not easy to maintain timely visits, purposeful visits, timely assessments, etc., in the conditions of COVID. It really is calling on social workers to go above and beyond and to make sure that they cross the threshold into a family home wherever possible, and try and make that experience as engaging as possible whilst parties are wearing personal protective equipment, etc., etc. This is exceptional social work practice in the current conditions, just to maintain compliance. And I'd like to echo the views earlier on that our staff are to be commended for both the improvement, but also the sustaining of improvement through the conditions that we're in. The challenge to the authority now, I think, is beginning to shift that compliance and leverage that into quality of practice. Just because we do things compliantly, it doesn't necessarily mean children are in receipt of a good service that results in good outcomes for them. And that is our test, is we need to start seeing improvements around that quality of practice so that we can secure good services to children and young people, and be more secure in our position vis-a-vis a judgment from the regulator. With that in mind, I do want to point out that we continue to have a core group of teams that are succeeding. They have been succeeding for a while, and credit goes to the managers and the staff in those teams. Also, the benefit is that those teams show how possible it is to deliver good practice in Gloucestershire, despite all the many conditions the organisation is under. We also have a number of teams that are struggling, have been struggling for some time, and those teams are very much in scope of a team improvement plan that Gail Hancock is leading on as the Interim Director of Safeguarding and Care. The approach to that is very much an intimate coaching one, where our improvement consultant, Simon Rushell, is offering coaching to those line managers to understand the barriers to them being able to progress and advance their teams, and to work closely with them to help move that forwards. We're also bringing to bear our quality and our performance information around those teams to wrap around them and offer the most supportive conditions possible. What we can see is a lot of benefit coming from that coaching approach, and I know that some of the bid that Chris has just mentioned that's been awarded by the DfE is dedicated to the affording our team managers coaching on a more wider basis. So again, that is a positive outcome. Where we can see practice needing to improve is for children subject to assessment in the system. So those are children that are recently entered and are being assessed to understand what their needs are. Children in need, so those are our Section 17 children, practice for them has improved significantly. Children subject to child protection, we still see a fair amount of variance there. Some of our best practice is available for children on child protection plans, but equally some of our weaker practice prevails in that area. Children in care are currently in receipt of a relatively good service based on the information we've been able to review in this reporting window, and care leavers have until recently been in receipt of a relatively good service, a strong RI stroke good service. But we've seen that dip in recent months, and attention is being paid to that by the senior managers and directors. In terms of the leadership, there remains resolve. I'm not going to repeat the things that Chris has said, representing the senior leadership team, but there remains a very strong resolve that we're not content with where we are, and we need to keep pressing forwards, not just to cross the line of requires improvement and secure our practice there, but to have aspirations for good and outstanding services for children. And we can see that drive continuing. The items of good practice that Chris mentioned earlier, quality assurance and performance, it is reassuring that the regulator agrees with that, but we're not content with those. Myself and my colleague, Kelly Headley, we're not content, and we continue to try and improve those areas of our practice. And there is a phased quality assurance program. We're in phase 2 of that. Phase 3 will come about next year, proximate to the inspection, which will look at us broadening our gaze around quality assurance. And I know that Kelly and her team are working on a new suite of performance tools that, again, are designed to increase the accuracy, reliability, and support managers to improve performance in their areas. So while month-on-month improvement is evident, we are drawing close to our targets, but these are not yet secure, and the emphasis needs to be maintained as is. One of the things that I'm very pleased with, if I may say in closing, is the regulators' view of us and their verbal feedback from the focused visit, that they described us as a learning organisation with an interest in authentic and transparent self-assessment. And I think that is a marked move on from the comments made by the regulator in 2017. But in addition to that, the response to the findings of areas for improvement, such as the team improvement plan that I've just mentioned, the permanency project that Philip Segarula is leading on, and the work to tackle re-referrals, the continued focus on the accelerated improvement plan, that shows that we're not just a learning organisation, but also that there's a fair amount of doing. So I think that that's a more satisfactory place than we've seen in the past, and bodes well for the future. I'll leave it there and welcome any feedback or queries.
Right, thank you, Rob. I don't have any indications from Andrea, but I'd like to ask a question, which is around the care leavers, the fact that you recognise that our offering to care performance towards care leavers has decreased. I mean, my question really is this driven by lockdown? Is it driven by the fact that it's more difficult to communicate with our care leavers? I'd also like to encourage the ambassadors. We've got 3 ambassadors on the line, Barley, Tamara and Becca. I'd be very keen to hear their views on it too. Hang on. Message from I've got a question. I do have a question from Stephen Davis. So actually, can we take your question, Stephen, and perhaps ask Rob to answer both my question and yours?
Thank you, Chair. Yes. I have to say, having read all the I don't want to say good news about the Ofsted report and Andrew's report, but the clearly improving news, I always find this report slightly depressing, because there clearly are teams where audits are not happening and not happening successfully, and the number that stays stubbornly consistent. In some cases in this report, the trends are in the wrong direction. My question is, what are we doing to address this? And do the teams who are consistently underperforming, are they aware of this, and are they concerned about this? Why are we not seeing more focus on this? Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Brian as well, but if you could answer those questions, Rob, that would be great.
Yes. So if I take the question in 2 parts, the one was around completion of audits, where we're not seeing timely or sufficient completion of audits. That isn't necessarily an indicator of performance by the team. It could well be that there's been a change of management and the managers haven't been trained and developed as auditors yet. And so we're compensating for that by bringing in auditors from elsewhere in the system, which will mean a reduction of numbers around that team. The second part of the question, as I understood it, was around what's being done for those teams that are demonstrating weaker performance or weaker quality. Are they aware, and how are they being developed? I think that those managers are very aware, both through the performance indicators and, as I mentioned, the team improvement plan. There were 14 teams, and another team has been added to that. So 15 teams that are very firmly in scope, where their performance by team and by worker within their team and their quality has been prepared in a bundle for those managers, shared with those managers in a very coaching methodology, as I mentioned, with our improvement consultant, Simon Rushell, who then draws alongside those managers and their senior managers to understand what are the conditions in those areas that are inhibiting the team's success. and then beginning to work through those via a team improvement plan in a very purposeful, methodical fashion. So yes, those teams are well aware of where improvement is needed. By and large, the managers have responded very well and have welcomed that input and support. It's still too early to say what the impact of that is in any definitive fashion. But what I would say is, in one of the management and leadership development programs that I was delivering, one of our exercises asked for the managers to share with us their self-evaluation of the team. And the one manager in that small group who stood head and shoulders above the rest was one who is subject to the coaching. And she said, I could only have given you that level of self-evaluation as a result of my coaching conversations that have really helped me to understand where the strengths and areas for development in my team are. So still very early days, but if that's any indication, it shows managers who are able to get their heads around the key issues and who hopefully with support will be able to move that forwards. So I hope that that's a sufficient answer, Councillor Davies. Happy to come back if needed.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I was okay until you said the last bit. It's still early days. It isn't. We've been doing this again and again, and we're getting report and report, and it doesn't feel we are getting. And I think I'm with you. I think it's the managers who are not driving this. We're not getting enough buy-in from some of the managers in some of the areas, and I just always wonder whether we should take a harder line in some places.
Yeah, Rob, could you respond to that?
I think that a hard line is being taken. My use of the term coaching, I wouldn't want to give the impression that that is a soft touch, almost counselling approach. We are being very clear that we're seeking accountability-based leadership. That's coming through in that intervention. It's also coming through in the management and leadership development program that we're running. And by accountability-based leadership, it's very clear understandings of the givens, the expectations, things that have to be delivered on, and then working with high support and high challenge to make sure that we're working towards those expectations. So there is no soft touch here. And I think people are very clearly aware of the importance and what needs to change. Also, I think that this approach will allow us to have a very clear evidence base for if remedial action or performance action needs to be taken, there will be very strong evidence to support why that's the case. So yes, I think it's fair to say there's a very firm grip being applied to this by Gail and her colleagues in the operational teams.
Thank you.
Could I just follow on from that in terms of an answer? Because it is a key issue, and it relates again to the time it takes to mature a workforce. There isn't a queue of people wanting to come to Gloucestershire as yet. If you look at our recruitment patterns, over the last 12 months, we've recruited 5 experienced social workers. They're just not out there. You'll get them through agency, but in terms of coming and committing and taking on a permanent contract, they're few and far between, because we're not yet the employer of choice. And even if we were, there aren't that many experienced social workers in the Southwest. The market is really poor. So we're having to develop our own people. We're having to create our own advanced practitioners and our own team managers. And what that means is, in effect, that we are quite an immature workforce. A lot of our frontline social workers are people who have just qualified. They've come through those pipelines that I referred to earlier, and they're still in their first 1 or 2 years of practice. And likewise, some of our advanced practitioners and team managers have been promoted, probably, if I'm honest, before their time. But because we can't access recruits from outside the county, so we have to promote them perhaps a little bit ahead of time, but then provide them with the support and challenge that they need to mature and develop as a team manager. And that's where Simon's work that Rob refers to in coaching and supporting these team managers is critical. It isn't a soft touch, as Rob says. It is challenging, but it's also appropriate in terms of, if you don't have access to a pool of people that you can fish from, external to Gloucestershire. You have to develop your own, and that does take time. So I think that's part of that theme earlier, which I referred to, which is it's difficult to turn an authority around because it takes time to develop these kinds of responses and this kind of workforce. So that's the process we're engaged in.
Thank you for that, Chris. Rob, you didn't answer my question about care leavers and why the performance had dropped off. I wonder if I can press you on that, please.
Yes, absolutely, Councillor Miller. And I wasn't trying to be avoidant. I wanted to take the opportunity to defer to the ambassadors, and then I'm happy to follow up on their responses. I think it would be wonderful to hear from them. I think they're a fantastic resource and usually very incisive and put many of us to the sword. So I'd much rather give them the space than me occupy it. And I'm happy to follow up after hearing from the three of them. So over to you, ambassadors. What do you think are the features of practice, if I can put it like that, that may be dropping off for our care leavers?
If I could ask Tamara to start off from the ambassadors, please.
Hi. So following on from what Rob just said, I think the main factors that have gone downhill basically is the fact that workers don't seem to be able to answer their phones as easily these days. You text your worker and you're waiting 2 to 5 hours for a reply, and you could be in something dire. I'll tell you what happened to me this month. I had mold in my apartment and all my furniture was gone, and my worker was so busy he couldn't answer his phone, and I was just sat there like, oh crap, what do I do? And if he'd have answered earlier, it wouldn't have been so scary. But because I have to wait for him to be less busy, because he has such a big caseload, I then have to try and sort out myself and be like, right, what can I do? What even could he do when he actually answers? But not just that. Of course, I'm not myself. I've got quite a good worker, but other people, they don't really actually hear from their workers. They don't get checked up on. They don't have meetings. They don't hear from them for months at a time. I think making sure workers actually check up on who they've got on their caseload would improve.
Thank you, Tamara. I don't know if Barney or Becca wants to speak too.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the problems is my personal experience is at the start of, all of this happening, I had 4 different caseworkers in the space of 3 months, and I never met any of them. And they kept on saying that we're going to meet up, we're going to this, and then eventually the 4th one called me up one day and said that they've taken me off and I don't have a caseworker anymore, even though I was currently asking someone for help and for assistance. They just classed me as I don't need any assistance anymore, and nobody followed up with that. Nobody checked if I needed any assistance during everything. They just kind of said, you're old enough, if you need us, call us. And I think that's quite irresponsible to expect the young person, especially someone like me with such high anxieties, and I feel like a hindrance if I was to call up and say, no, I still need assistance. And I feel like there's a real lack of follow-ups with people after the case, because they just expect them to get hold of the caseworkers themselves, when I know we're old enough, but I think it's still the responsibility of we should still be cared for in that sense.
Thank you, Barley. Is there anything you'd like to add?
Hi. There's only a small bit I'd like to add. For me, during COVID, I've experienced a lack of meetings. I used to have phone call meetings, probably once a week, once every 2 weeks, or she'll come out and see me. But that stopped mostly during COVID. I think we had probably 4 or 5 check-ins, and but now for me, my work has now left, so I don't actually have one. I'm waiting to get a new one. But in general, I think that it's affected quality time and building a rapport, because nobody can get out to see them, and there's just not a lot of contact time, and that's really important in making sure that they get the support that they receive.
Thank you, Barley. Well, Chris, over to you. I think 2 out of our 3 ambassadors don't have a support worker now.
Yeah, I mean that's indicative of why we need to continue to improve. I mean that at the end of the day, you can have all the data and all the quality assurance and all the reassurance that I give you, but the real thing that counts is the views of the young people and their day-to-day lives and what they're experiencing. Until we begin to have an impact on that, then nobody can rest comfortable in their beds at night that we're doing a good job. So, the care leaver service is another one of those 4 services that is under very close scrutiny at the moment. I referred to 4 earlier in the proceedings where I mentioned the fostering service. The care leaver service is the second of those 4 services. And they are going through a period of transition at the moment as well, where we're looking at the possibility of creating a separate care leaving service and personal assistance to support young people. We increased the number of those people to support care leavers last year through the budget, and I believe that we've got an increased allocation this year as well, from memory. So there will be a little bit of churn, but for a good reason, in that those new appointments will have a smaller caseload. So contact should be more frequent. But I do despair sometimes when I hear that phone calls aren't returned or followed up, because actually, when we are working remotely and at home, I think in some respects the job is made a lot more difficult, but in some respects it's made a bit easier as well. And I would have thought telephone contact with young people would have been an element of our practice that is easier. Bearing in mind, and I think, Tamara, Barley and Becca would all agree that, sometimes young people aren't always responsive on the phone, then they don't always answer when people do try and connect with them. But I would want a better story than the one that we've just heard. I'm not happy with that. And I will speak to our teams and our managers within the care leaving service about social workers being more available and more responsive to young people. The other thing, I think it was Becca that said, somebody said to them that she should be able to cope now. Well, actually, being told that you should be able to cope and being able to cope are 2 different things, aren't they? And I do think we should be a bit more vigilant in talking to young people about our decision making in terms of whether they do in themselves feel able to cope or not. I was fortunate. I had a very secure upbringing and, good parents and people that loved and cared for me. But at their age, I was still, if somebody cut me adrift, I'd still be pretty anxious about that. If my mum and dad had turfed me out at 20 and said, you're on your own, boy, I would have still been a bit concerned about that, despite the fact that I was a fairly together young man. So, yeah, it's not, we have to take that seriously, and I will speak to managers within the care leaving service. This is why it's good to have good ambassadors on boards like this, and that's why I have them as mentors, because they tell me the way it is.
Thanks, Chris. When you've done that, can you perhaps get some feedback and perhaps get back to the next committee to say exactly what's been done and what the what's changed as a result?
Yeah, of course, Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you. Tamara, did you just want to come back on that?
Yeah. Mine is a bit from when you were talking about having new workers and stuff. And I was just thinking, actually, sometimes it's a good thing to have new workers like the SYE, because when we've done our training, the new ones always seem to be the ones that take more notes. They take it back to their groups and you see it in practice. Whereas the ones that have been social workers for a while, managers for a while, sometimes they don't quite listen to us because they think, oh, I know what I'm doing. I don't need advice from like an 18-year-old. Do you know what I mean? So sometimes I know it might take a bit longer to improve, but having those new workers could actually benefit you quite a lot. Having us train them and actually going out there and face to face with children and having those views that we've given them, it'll improve practice.
Yeah, see, Tamara, you've nailed it again, haven't you? You know, you're spot on in terms of what we're trying to do is create a workforce that we've shaped and conditioned to work in certain ways and in the way that you describe, actually. And one of we've got two problems within Gloucestershire, I think, in terms of workforce. One is to get good pipelines, secure pipelines of people coming into the profession, undergoing training and becoming a social worker. That's one challenge. The other challenge is the one that you referred to, really, which is we've also got a group of social workers that have been here for a very, very long time and are used to working in a certain way. And part of the other challenge that I and the senior leaders have within the team is to change some of those behaviours so that people begin to operate in a better way and provide better services to children and young people. And that's the other side of the challenge. There's the provision of new people who, in many respects, are easier to shape and mould and train than, you know, old dogs like me that have been around for years and set in their ways. So I think we've got to do both, is what I'm saying.
Well, thank you, Chris. Well, I don't know about old and young. I'm sure you're still a together young man. Andrea, if we could make a note to have an agenda item, just next meeting to follow up on those actions, I'd be grateful if the committee is willing. Because I think it's important that when things are raised, that they are followed up on. I've got Brian, and then I've got Leslie, and then I think we should move on to the next agenda item after that, because I'm conscious it's just gone 12. So over to you, Brian.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I mean, on that last point, I think the shifting ground of what's acceptable and what's expected communication is something that affects councillors as well. I've been a councillor, I think, for about 12 years. But 12 years ago, if somebody raised a point with you, they probably would be quite happy to wait maybe a few weeks to get a response. But nowadays, when you get an email in your mailbox, within a day or two, probably less than a day, they're often back saying, you know, have you got an answer? And what these people want isn't necessarily the answer. They want to know that you've received it and you're actually going to be doing something with it. So they want the storyline that's going with what you're going to do next. And that's really relatively quite easy to do now that we've got text messaging and emails, but it's not something that we always think of doing. But I think it's important, and I think it's certainly important for young people because what we all want to do is to know that somebody else understands our problem and is on our side and doing something about it. And if you've got to wait hours, or if you've got to wait months for some response, or if there's not even anybody to go to, which seems to be the case sometimes, that's very difficult. And so my point on that is that I can't see why, as a service, we can't have a place to go for people, even if they haven't actually got their own social worker attached to them. Surely we can collectively have an ability to respond to people's needs and pick up things. So I think there's a service change that could go in there that could make us a bit more modern and up to date with what is actually what every counsellor has to deal with. And actually, I think families do too. You know, when children go out nowadays, the parents want to know where they are and things in a way that you didn't years ago. And that's part of life. We're in a communicated world that requires everybody to be in touch. But my point I wanted to raise was, Rob, I'm very pleased with this report because I think this work on audits is probably the most consistent piece of work that does give us a sort of warts and all picture of what's going on. And it's very focused on whether it's delivering outcomes and whether we've got good practices in place that allow good outcomes to come from what we're doing. So watching the reports over the months, I've found very valuable. And this report really does show that where we're getting the process, because with the more consistency in staff and the focus on the training and development, we've now got some teams that are working quite well. There's more work needed, but I think the ability to use a range of management styles to work with the individuals to try and get different outcomes, I think is the right way forward. So I think that seems to be good. It's what Chris has been saying, that you're doing that, and clearly investment in the academy. So my question, I suppose, is around two things. One, does Rob have a view on whether the consistency of process will start to bear down on the number of times children come back into care over time as we start to deliver good service? Does he feel that that will reduce the number of children coming back into care repeatedly? Because we obviously are dealing with a legacy issue there, but can we stop that? The other question is, as far as I can see, Rob's only looking at how we process children in that sense once they come under our wing. So it's looking at the services we provide, and I just wondered if there was any scope for this approach to be worked with our partners and perhaps in the schools to see whether we can enhance the quality of work done to bring children under our eyesight. If that's another area where we've got concerns that we're not actually identifying all the children that meet needs, could we be using this audit process to up our game at the front end? Thanks.
So if I take those questions in turn, Councillor Robinson, the view on the consistency of our process and the effect of that on entries into care, or rather number of children in our care, if I broaden it slightly, I have little doubt that if we improve in the manner that we are improving up and down the system, we will see a reduction of children in our care for the right reasons, absolutely for the right reasons, both moral, for the outcomes of those children and from the benefit of the organisation. And the reason that I say that is that at present, one of our areas for development is around analysis and threshold decision-making, if I can use a bit of jargon. And threshold decision-making is really the decision applied by professionals at the respective gateway points through children's social care. And that determines whether a child is held in early help, whether they're held as a child in need on a child protection plan, whether they enter our care, and whether they return home. And that's an area that is in need of improvement. We've recognised that in the report, where we talk about the ability to conceptualise practice and improved analysis. So tighter decisions in that respect will help us to have a fairer reflection of who should be sitting in the respective parts of the service, including children in care. So that's one point. The second point is, as we put an emphasis on purposeful visiting and interventions and better quality plans, it should be, under common sense and logic, that we see greater impact by the service in the lives of children and families, and we're then able to hold them at a more proportionate level, which could prevent them coming into care in the first instance. And then thirdly, from a more tactical perspective, under the leadership of Gail and Philip Segarula, we're doing some very deliberate work around the margins of our care cohorts. So as you heard from Chris, children on the edge of care and those coming into care through that threshold gateway should be subject to much higher levels of scrutiny and demands for improvements in the quality of practice. The scrutiny and improvements needed around children in pre-proceedings and in proceedings is directly relevant to the children coming into care and whether we're getting it right for those children coming in. Also, what we need to get right is, once children do transition into our care, that the quality of their planning in relation to their placements and their permanence is much improved. And that's well understood by Philip in his attention on the permanency project. So rather than having children coming into care in an unplanned way or in an unstable way, which sets them off on the wrong footing, we should see them coming in a more deliberate fashion, which should secure their stay in care. And why that's so important is we have an emphasis to return children home wherever it is safe and suitable to do so. The evidence is absolutely clear. Children benefit from being in the care of their families unless it's patently obvious that that's unsafe and unhealthy for them. And so we've just relaunched some reunification guidance that should help to frame the expectations of good practice returning children home. And I think that's particularly key in relation to your question, Councillor Robinson, because you've mentioned repeat entries to care. If we've not done that reunification work well, it's therefore likely that the return home would break down and those children then need to return into our care. So that reunification guidance that has just been launched and is being reinforced across the system is absolutely critical to us reducing the returns to care in an unhelpful fashion. Then taking the next question, which was around wider, possibly multi-agency quality assurance, there is a multi-agency quality assurance group, quality assurance and improvement group under the GSCE, where that conversation is being held. How do we integrate across the board to do multi-agency auditing, etc.? One of the things that I would be more cautious about, if I followed your question directly, is would we apply our audit approach and our audit methodology into other agencies? I'm not sure that we're yet at that place or that level. And if I can just backstop that, my experience of having worked in the NHS and in youth support and now in the local authority is far and away Ofsted Children's Social Care are the most demanding regulator of all of them. They're more demanding than HMIP, they're more demanding than the CQC who oversees health. And so the quality expectations on children's social care are much higher than they are of our colleague areas. So I'm not sure that they would be open to the kind of rigor and demand that our audit methodology would require of their areas. But that's not to say that we don't continue to collaborate and see what we can cross-pollinate between the different services. And as I say, that work is starting under the GSCE. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. The first part I thought was very encouraging because it does give a show of what the brighter future might be like, because that sounds very good. And the second part, I think I would push to say that if we are the most regulated, but we actually understand the role better, we should actually be trying to make sure we share our audit qualities with others, because at the end of the day, it's the quality of work that protects our children. So we shouldn't just accept somebody else's standards if they're not good enough. Thanks.
So yeah, thank you very much, Brian. Rob, if you weren't so short of time, maybe this is something for another meeting. I'd quite like to pick up on the reunification work that you were talking about, but sadly we are running short of time and still have a whole agenda item left. So I'd like to invite Leslie to pose her question, and I think we'll draw a line under this agenda item, if that's okay with members. Thank you. Leslie.
Much, Andrew, and it's really just an observation. Well, it is a question, an observation about what was said by Tamara. I mean, thank you very much for telling us, because I think it's your presence and being able to contribute in this way is so useful. So thank you very much indeed for that. And I think that it's disappointing, it's worrying to hear it, because sometimes you have to pluck up courage to make the phone call saying, "Can you help?" And so I do think it's something that should be taken very seriously, because if they then don't get a reply, it preys on one's mind. So it is important. And what happens to out of hours if a care leaver needs to get hold of somebody? I think in the past when we've talked about that, we've been told that the provision is there, but can we have some reassurance, please? And also that you should be able to cope. Well, I'm now getting quite old, and sometimes I can't cope, and everybody needs somebody they can turn to. And at the moment, when we could keep talking about people's well-being, well, part of well-being not being well is actually finding it hard to cope. And as I say, if I, with my vintage years, find it hard, other people will also find it hard. So it's something that really should be heard. And if anybody told me you should be able to cope, I think I don't know, throw a pot of jam at them or something. But it does have to be taken really seriously. So thank you, Chris, for listening to that. And I hope we can act on it pretty promptly. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. There was a message in the chat from tomorrow which wouldn't be heard by external audiences, which was that most care leavers don't know about out-of-hours service. I don't know if that's something you want to reflect on, Chris, but can you address Leslie's questions, points?
I'm not sure Leslie was asking a question, but I agree with the sentiment of what she was saying. And absolutely, I'd already made a note of out-of-hours provision and what we're doing to publicise that when I saw it pop up in the chat from Tamara and Barley. So we can incorporate that into the report that we bring back. Leslie, have I missed something, or was there a question in that? I mean,
well, you've picked it up, Chris, about the out-of-hours service and how it actually works, and making sure that the people who need to know about it do know about it. So thank you.
Yes. I mean, how do we advertise these things, Chris, to care leavers? I know we've got a care leavers offer. I can't remember if the out-of-hours service is mentioned in that or not. I don't recall it being mentioned. And presumably that's something that we're going to update from time to time. But if we could get that message out to people, because if our ambassadors don't know about it, how are the vast majority of our care leavers going to know about it?
Yeah, I agree. Again, it's something, as I sit here, I feel very disappointed to hear, because there is an out-of-hours service and there is an emergency service. So, the fact that young people don't know about that is a disappointment to me, really. So we'll incorporate the overview of provision in the paper that we bring back. But more importantly, I'll speak to the head of service about publicising that. And I do write to care leavers from time to time as well directly, so I can always incorporate details of that service in those letters that I circulate.
Chris, I'd like to move on to our last substantive agenda item now, agenda item 6, the Children's Services Performance Report. And just before I introduce Andy Dempsey, I'd like to say how much I appreciated the key messages at the start of the report. I think for me, this was a great way of kind of summarising in a couple of pages, really, what the report was all about. So well done on that. Over to you. Yes, sorry, the revenue report as well. I beg your pardon. Yes, over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Chair. I won't go through the report in detail, but perhaps highlight where we are in terms of performance. Can I also address some of the concerns of members about the way we use performance? Like Chris, I wasn't happy to hear what the ambassadors have said. That doesn't square with our performance data. So what we tend to do then is go back and look at our keeping in touch and caseload data to explore, well, okay, what does that mean in terms of children? How many children have not been seen or not been responded to or don't have an allocated worker? So we do try and use this data directly in a way that translates the aggregate numbers into the experiences of individual children and young people. But briefly, you'll see the report. The first page gives an overview, and that's on page, I think, is it 20 of your pack? Sorry, no, page 29 of the pack. And that really summarises where we are at the moment. Performance is continuing to improve in a good number of areas, but is not yet fully secure or where we would want it to be in all areas. And the most obvious areas of concern are what we call repeat work, so re-referrals into the MASH, which, as members have discussed earlier, may suggest our previous work was not effective, or some continuing anxiety or concern by partners. Repeat child protection planning, i.e. those children who are coming back onto a plan either within a year or 2 years, and also readmissions to care, into care. An underlying issue as well is placement stability, i.e. that's the number of changes in carer that the child has had over the period, and those are a huge area of focus at the moment. On pages 30 and 31, we've summarised performance in a red, amber and green breakdown, and you'll see that the majority of our indicators are in green and amber, which means they're either on target or within range of target. And where we've highlighted the direction of travel in red, that means there's been some decline there, but they remain in those phases. I think another important point within this report, we've actually stretched some of our targets. So as we've improved, we've actually increased our appetite and improved our targets to bring them more in line with good and outstanding authorities. So there's an extent to which we are stretching ourselves, so the reports are not directly comparable from 1 month to the next, because we may have stretched some targets. And then the other thing I'd like to draw attention to, the executive summary on pages 33 onwards through to, I think, 36, is followed by a demand dashboard, which again is a relatively recent development. We brought all the demand profiles to the front of the report so that whoever's reading the report can understand what's going on in terms of the volume of business. And you'll see that there's been a steady increase in the numbers of children open to children's social care, driven in the main by a growth in the number of children in care, children subject to protection plans, and a marginal increase in care leavers, some of which with care leavers may reflect a number of care leavers who we are accumulating due to the extension of our duty up to 21 and 25, depending on the situation of the young person. So overall, I think it's an encouraging picture, but we are, as Chris said, absolutely clear that we're not where we want to be. And I broadly agree with the assertion that requires improvement, subject to us addressing those areas of repeat business. And as I've said in relation to what the ambassadors have told us this morning, what we do when we hear that type of narrative, and I thank them for taking us through that, is we'll cross-check that with the numbers, because the numbers would suggest that the care leaving service is in touch with care leavers, but we need to test that on a day-to-day basis, and that's what we do. So we're not just reliant on these numbers, which are in the main measures of timeliness and volume. We cross-check that with the findings from case file audits, but also the views and experiences of young people, just to make sure this data is correct. So I don't know if that's a helpful overview, Chair. I'm conscious that you've had a lot to go through, but I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments on the detail of the report.
Thank you. Yes, I've got indications from Stephen Davis and Barley Chatterton. Barley, can I invite you first?
Yeah, hi. I was just skimming through the report and I noticed that it said under half of children undergoing a conference had completed a My Views form, and I was just wondering if how that could be improved, because I feel like for a conference it's really important to get the children's views.
Yeah, thank you, Bolly. That's a really good point. I think right throughout the child protection process, through the use of My View forms and the use of advocacy, we are trying to improve. It's just something that we continue to promote. with our workforce and with the reviewing service itself, and we track it closely. It is improving, but it's not where it needs to be. The My View form isn't the only mechanism to obtain children's views, but it is an important one. So the only thing I can say is there's a whole range of things going on in terms of using our performance surgeries to highlight areas or instances where that's not being used, and generally promoting the use of the My Views form throughout the service, both in the operational teams and in the reviewing service. And it's just a sort of constant reiteration of that message. But any ideas that people might have, are always willing to explore those if we've not done already.
Chair, it's Rob England here. If I may come in on the back of that.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, just to confirm what Andy was saying, Barley, is that there are, as you well know, lots of different ways to get children's and young people's views and thoughts, wishes and feelings. And unfortunately, Liquid Logic only really lets us capture the My Views form at the press of a button. But I've been doing some work going through recent records of conferences for quite a lot of our chairs. And I'm pleased to say that almost all of those minutes from conferences, at the start of them, talk about the views of the child or the young person and the family. Now, I think quite a lot of those haven't been captured through My Views. They've been represented either at the conference by the parent, the young person, or they've been obtained by the social worker and brought to the conference, and sometimes by the child protection chair. So I think people are capturing more than the performance shows. But I agree with Andy. Any ideas on how we improve that would be gratefully received.
Sure. Thanks, Rob. Does the fact that it's not captured in My Views on Liquid Logic mean that the views of children are less well communicated across social workers?
I don't know that we could say that definitively, Chair. I think my preference for My View is that it's well structured, and from a data perspective, which is my concern, we can evidence that, as Rob said, at the push of the button. I don't know that any greater or lesser value is given to one particular mechanism for obtaining children's views. So I couldn't be definitive on that. My preference is that My View is well structured and gives us the ability to report accurately and cogently.
Okay, thanks for that, Andy. I've got Stephen Davis, I've got Brian Robinson, and I have a couple of points of my own at the end. So, Stephen.
Thank you, Chair. And this report, I think, like much of the discussion today, shows sustained improvement, and it does identify, I know, areas where improvement is still needed, but I think it's really, really interesting. We were talking earlier about, marking out the Ofsted letter for good and bad. One of the things I do on this report is whenever the teams are listed, I look to see and draw whether they are increasing, decreasing, or there is any trend or suggestion that one team is doing particularly better than another. And what's absolutely fascinating is the variance in those charts, where a team may start at the bottom on the first of the 3 months and be at the top by the end. I just wondered if you had a comment on the comparative performance of teams, which seems to be consistently inconsistent. I just wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Thank you, Stephen. I think there's a number of causes that we can discern through the surgeries. Firstly, there may be churn in the team, and that undermines consistency as new people come into the team and perhaps not familiar with the ethos or approach that's been developed. So you get change in the management, and consistency of the team is probably the most prominent issue. Another one is the demands that may occur in a particular area. So there may be variability in the demand profile, which impacts on metrics, which are very focused on timeliness. There may also be issues of staffing, and sometimes it's the sheer persistence and resilience that's needed to develop good practice and then deliver that on a day-to-day basis, which is the work that we're doing through the practice fundamentals and accountability work that we're doing, But you're right. We put those team and locality performance data in, and it does show consistency. I think what Rob's beneath the locality level, what you will see in Rob's report is the inconsistency of in the quality of practice is increasingly confined to a smaller number of teams. So where we are seeing consistency is the case file auditing speaks to quality, and the poor quality work is reducing to a smaller number of teams, and a greater number of teams are delivering a more consistent quality of practice. But you're right, we review it month by month, and in the locality surgeries, we try and understand what is going on there. Is it that a lapse in concentration, or is there some other situational factor related to staffing or demand that's impacting on that area? And it's just a constant conversation, I'm afraid.
Yeah, and just to get, I wasn't a criticism that they were varied. I was just intrigued in the thinking behind why they varied so much. I mean, many of the teams are doing very well, you know, in a lot of the time. Thank you.
Stephen, I didn't take it as a criticism at all. So I thought it was a good question, and we do try and understand it on a month-by-month basis.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Andy. Brian.
Thanks, Chairman. Yeah, my question is going to focus on foster placements, I think, or children in care. Just to understand what's behind these numbers a little bit more. Because I did notice in your summary report earlier on that we've actually got more children out of county now. And so I wondered whether we had, and I think Ofsted also talked about adequacy of placement capacity. So on the report on page 47, it tells us that we've got 241 children in care, in foster care, and we've got 216 foster care approved foster carers, but only just over half of those are actually currently taking, 57% are currently taking children. So those 241 children presumably are therefore spread over just over 120 foster carers, which seemed quite a high number of children per foster care. It was actually looking at that, I suddenly thought, we really don't understand the shape of the foster care placements. Do we have lots of children in single placements, or are they mostly in family placements, or do some foster care sort of 5, 6, 7, 8 children? I have no idea. So my question really is, could you give us a bit more information about the nature of our foster care placements and the capacity, and why we've only got 57% in use, and whether we could up that as part of not sending so many children out of care?
Thank you, Brian. That's a really good question, and I'm glad you've gone to this section of the report. The first thing I would say, until I think 2 months ago, we didn't have this data in this form. We weren't able to report and understand this issue at all. We've only brought this through liquid logic reporting. I think in July was the earliest report that we had this data, and it's taken quite a while. Previously, the foster care service has generated its data outside of liquid logic, with all that implies for its accuracy and exhaustiveness. Coming on to your question, we must sweat and use as much of our in-house foster care capacity as possible, for the reasons you'll appreciate. That will mean the children are in county and are in a familial situation. We didn't know, I think, as accurately as we do in this report, the level of underutilisation. I'm certainly, Chris, would be used to an in-house foster utilisation rate of 85% or thereabouts. You'll always have some spare capacity, but the majority of available places will have children. Now, we understand some of the undertow here in that we had a proportion of foster carers who were shielding or not able to take children due to the constraints of COVID. And I think that impacted on somewhere between 40 and 50 available placements. What we're doing at the moment is working through a process with the remaining foster carers to understand whether that is real capacity, i.e. they have a place available for children and what type of children they can take, or in some cases, whether they are no longer available and they need to go to panel and be deregistered as a foster carer. What I can tell you, Brian, is that occupancy rate is already increasing from this September report. So we are beginning to see better use and utilisation of our in-house foster carer capacity. And it's precisely why we wanted to bring this reporting into this integrated form, was to be able to understand and make better use of existing in-house capacity. So some of it is situational, and some of it we are working through on an individual basis to understand whether that placement capacity is real and available and we can use it going forward. So I expect that percentage utilisation to increase in the coming months.
Yeah, come back. Part of the question was also getting an understanding of the number of children in each foster care placement. Do you have a handle on that, or is that something to follow?
That's someone that we can follow. What we've got, you're right. We know the number of children placed in house and the number of children being capable of being placed in house, but I can't give you, as we speak, the precise distribution of children per placement. So you're right. Have we got one placement with 2 children, another with 3, another with none? But we can certainly look at that and come back to a future meeting.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. Can I ask one final question on the report? I'm just looking through the key summary, and the one at the bottom of the summary is stability of social worker. That's not stability of placement, but stability of social worker, which has been poor for 12 months and impacts 20% of children are on admission. And I guess what concerns about me is that could be an Achilles heel as far as getting our eye goes, as far as Ofsted. Is this going to cause us some problems, and what are we doing about it?
Thank you. It has improved, but only marginally. And it is a slow process. It will, as Chris said, as we stabilise our workforce and we reduce our agency dependency, it will improve. It will be a line of inquiry, and it has been a line of inquiry. What we need to show is that as we see change of practitioner, that there is a continuation and consistent approach to our work for that child or family, to ensure that they don't fall in the gaps in terms of unacceptable risk or a gap in our work with that family. So what we need to do while we're still in this process of turnover in our workforce, which my estimation is it will continue to improve, but it'll be at a relatively steady rate. It's not going to be orders of magnitude better if they come back in the spring. It will be improved, but it won't be where we want it to be. So our approach has been to make sure that management oversight, the use of the practice fundamentals and essentials of practice provide for consistency of practice and good management oversight as a case transfers from one worker to another. And I think what we found during the focused visit, when they did look at a good number of cases, although they noted and were right to flag the instability and inconsistency for some children of allocated worker, they did not see children being left at risk due to that change. So we've just got to mitigate it, Chair, the best way we can and continue to stabilise our workforce. I don't know whether Chris wants to add anything to that. Hopefully I've covered the main issues.
No, I think you've covered it, Andy. I mean, it's again it's another one of those bullet points, and the fact that it's in our performance report, should give us some comfort that and evidence that we're aware of the issue, we're monitoring it closely, and we're doing something about it. But as I said, the stability of our workforce is something that will take a while to achieve. It's not an overnight thing. But as Andy's indicated, we are moving towards having a more stable workforce. The other thing, of course, is we've done quite a lot of reorganisation and transformation, and that will continue, and that doesn't help social worker stability. You have to make those changes, and often that will include a change of social worker, and that's sort of short-term pain for longer-term gain.
Sure. Okay. I understand that. As long as we're confident that there is an upward, that our current actions are likely to result in an upward trajectory. I think that's the key thing. I'd like to move on to the last agenda item 7.
There's just one question I had to ask. I don't know if I maybe send it by email. It's about two young people who haven't been in school since November last year, and I just wonder what would happen about it. But if you want to give me that answer by email, I'd be really grateful.
Yeah, I think if we can take that offline, let's specific.
Will do, Leslie.
Thanks.
Now, who's taking it? Is it Suzanne? And if so, is she here? Yes. Suzanne, can I speak to your report, agenda item 7, the 2020-21 Revenue Budget Monitoring Report?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I'll pick that up. So you've got the report in your packs, and this is the report which has the actuals to August and the forecast in September. Now, the non-DSG position is showing an overspend of 14.6 million, but that does include estimated COVID costs of about 7.2 million, so giving it an underlying underspend of about 7.4 million. And as the issue with that underspend is the same as we've been discussing over the last, it's probably year. External placements, an overspend of 8.9 million, safeguarding staff 1.6 million, and home to school transport about 2.8 million. A lot of these figures are affected by COVID, and the COVID expenditure is across 5 areas really. It's affecting increased funding. And most of this cost will be covered by the COVID grant that we're getting from the central government. So the 5 areas that it's affecting are external placements, where we are seeing just transitions and costs of external placements increasing. Home to school transport, which is more costly to transport children to school because of distancing requirements. Also, our staffing, we've got a contingency for staffing if activity could increase over the next few months. And the final thing is to support vulnerable pupils as they are in school with additional help. So those are the key areas of the COVID expenditure. As the report highlights, it's quite difficult sometimes to identify what's a true COVID cost and what's just an underlying position. But those are the key costs that we're seeing are coming through the system. I think with the external placements, there have been a higher number of placements and the costs, and there's a lot of uncertainty around that. As the report picks out, we have a number of things that are the impact of, finding the report, the impact of the transitions. And there's also other areas such as the opening of Travone that will cause that the uncertainty, the use of the in-house foster carers, as you've just heard, and the impact of that as well. In terms of the DSG position is 13.5 million overspent, but that includes a carry forward of 8.4 million and also a deficit budget that was set at the beginning of this year of 5.4 million. And that was so that we actually set realistic budgets to reflect the trends and the costs that we were seeing coming through at the beginning of the year. And there is a continued pressure on the high needs budget, as there is nationally on that budget. And we are looking to see how we can resolve that through a spending review of all the high needs budget and a different way of looking at the high needs costs. Special school places and top-ups are the key area of pressure, and that impacts on the independent special schools and that budget as well. The only other area to mention is there is an underspend on the early years provision of forecast of 300,000, and that's just due to a lower take-up of 3 and 4-year-old places at this point in time. So those are some of the key aspects that are included in the report, Chair.
Very much. Yes, I guess no one really is surprised by an overspend during COVID times. So I've got, I think I've got two people wanting to ask questions. Got Brian and Leslie. If there's anybody else, do get your hands up quickly. Anybody else? Brian and Leslie? No, okay. Brian?
Yes, thanks, Chairman. Just two areas of question, really. The first one is around the high needs block. I know that alternative provision education has been a key part of some of the pressures over previous years. We've talked about the challenges schools are having, but we don't think we've picked up anything on how difficult it's been for alternative provision schools to continue to function, whether they are able to function, because they may well have problems working in a COVID environment. What's impact that's had on the costs for those schools and the outcomes for children. But so that's one area really, is APS and the high needs. The second one is just a simple question. There's a rise in homeschooling. Presumably when children are homeschooled, the budget is lost to Gloucestershire. Does it then follow the pupil to somewhere to the home, or is it a saving for the government?
Yeah,
I'll pick up on some of the just the financial side of those, Brian. And the first thing about the alternative provision is actually the numbers against those budgets are now actually showing a small underspend because we're managing the activity that's going through the alternative provision. So there's no additional costs that we're seeing that are coming through the alternative provision. In terms of how they're operating under COVID, I'll let Chris must probably respond to that particular point. In terms of the homeschooled pupils, yes, we do lose that money from our educational system, and that will therefore not be an allocation that the DfE will have to give out. Therefore, yes, it is a saving to the centre.
So the quantum of that, last time I did the math, was 6.125 million saved, because we've got over 1,000 young people being home educated. If you take the average secondary AWPU, that's 5,000. It's a little less for primary, but if you times 1,000, and we've got over 1,000 now, about 1,050 odd, something like that, then I worked it out on the numbers to be 6.125 million. So it's a huge amount of money that's lost to schools in the county. That's the other way of looking at it. So I've been talking to head teachers about the need to really interrogate parents at the point where they declare an interest in home education, and to put to them the advantages and disadvantages of that decision for young people. Some of it's COVID related. We compared the September figures this year from last year, and again, these may be a few points out, but last year there were something like 36, if I remember, could have been 38 parents who elected to home educate. This September there were about 153. So there's been a 4 or 5-fold increase month on month from September this year and last. Some of that, as I say, is COVID related, but not all of it. And I do think it does warrant quite a serious look at our education system more broadly in terms of the types of children they're able to accommodate is potentially becoming less. You know, children with high levels of anxiety, children on the autistic spectrum, and that worries me, if I'm honest. I do think school should be for everybody, and I do think schools should be able to accommodate everybody. So the fact that we've got over 1,000 children out of school in the county is a worry to me, not just financially, but I think more broadly in terms of whether that's in children's best interests. Undoubtedly it is in some cases, but I really don't think it is in the majority. And of course it brings with it, I think, Brian, you've raised in the past, the extra safeguarding issues that are associated with children that are out of school, because you don't have ears and eyes or boots on the ground, however you want to describe it, that are monitoring those children's welfare.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. I mean, we don't have the right to go into people's houses where children are being home educated to see how they're getting on, do we, Chris?
No, we don't. Not unless we think there is a safeguarding issue, then we do. So, you know, we do have rights of entry on those grounds, but not on the grounds of we want to check whether your education provision is sufficient or adequate enough. We don't have that, although government are looking closely at that, and I wouldn't be surprised at some point in the future if legislation changed and we did then get additional duties returned to local authorities, because of course we used to have them, and we used to have to provide home visits to home educated children on a regular basis. When I first became a young officer, that was part of our statutory role.
And is the government introducing a consultation on that?
Yeah, I believe so. It's either underway or about to be underway. But there's a lot of noise in the system about the need to do something about it.
Yes, I can appreciate that. I mean, not for today, but perhaps at some point in the future, it might be good to get a briefing on that.
Yeah, I mean, the numbers are eye-watering, Andrew. I mean, if you think about us and the size of the county being give or take a few bob around 1% of the nation's population of school children, and we're missing out on 6.1 million. You times that by 100, and central government are saving up to £600 million if other areas are in keeping with ours in terms of the numbers of elected home educated children. And last time I checked the Southwest figures, we weren't out of line. We're not an outlier. We're pretty much in the pack. So 600 million is probably close to what central government are saving by parents opting to home educate.
Barney, did you want to come in here? I haven't forgotten you, Leslie.
What, in regards to what I said in the chat?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just feel like the reason a lot of children don't go to school is affected by bullying, whether it's online or offline. I think it's massively affected by offline at the minute, especially due to how much the internet is used, because everyone's bored because you can't go outside. I've got family members who have been off school. They've got friends who are 12 years old and suicidal, and nothing is done at school, whether it's bullying or whether it's mental health. And I experienced the same back when I was at school, but I know it's currently still happening, and it's probably a factor that's affecting children being homeschooled.
Thank you, Barney. I think that's something it would be good to pick up at some point at the time at this committee, though it may need to be in the next session of the council. Leslie, last but definitely not least, your question.
Well, I will just say something about home reading, because we had a paper come to the LGA Children's Board about it, and one of the concerns, I mean, it is completely recognised that something needs to be done, because there is not much point if an officer from GCC hasn't got access. You know, they can go and knock at the door, but it doesn't mean so they're going to be let in. So there has been a paper go to the board. And one of the concerns about is actually how is it going to be managed, because people are saying do councils, because there's been so much sort of reshaping or cutting back, you know, it's the capacity, you know, will they be able to actually undertake it? So it is being considered. The question I wanted to ask was actually about home transport, because I thought I'm interested to know why it's up. Is that because there's an overspend? Is that because there had to be some reorganisation because of ferrying people to school, and they can't take more than a certain number in a vehicle, or why is it? And I had also wondered, was because probably many of the people who do give home to school transport could be independent people, and if they're not getting the business from the county council, what's happening to them? Because I remember early on in when we were discussing the financial aspects of the effect of the pandemic, a guidance from central government was that businesses shouldn't be seen to be financially suffering because they're not getting the amount of business they would do from a county council, and therefore the county council had to compensate. And does that apply to our independent home to school transport providers? Thank you.
Yeah, Chris.
Yeah, so in short and in the round, that's absolutely the case. We continue to fund transport companies right throughout lockdown. So they were paid for transporting children, even though there was no children to transport. Similarly, when lockdown was lifted, there were certain restrictions on children travelling in a single taxi together. So additional costs were incurred in order to meet the requirements of social distancing. The other underlying factor is a market factor, Leslie. I think if you look at the MTFS process over the last few years, there were quite significant savings taken out of the home to school transport budget. And consequently, the market has shrunk. There's less providers willing to transport children because the returns are quite small, and so they've dropped out of the market. And there are some private providers who won't bid in that particular space because the returns aren't high enough. And so what's happened is that we've, in our enthusiasm to drive efficiencies out of the market, got to the point where the market has been weakened, and therefore there's a bounce back in price because of a lack of competition. So what we're finding is that whenever a contract is relet, that it's returned at quite a higher cost for the same route than it was previously let for. And I think I've been talking to Colin Chick and others in the corporate leadership team, because I think one of the ways of correcting this aberration, as I see it in the market, is to enter it ourselves as a provider and generate our own an element of our own home to school transport. And if we did that, then I think through insourcing we can provide competition where competition will solve the problem, but add to capacity within the market as well.
Thank you, Chris. Leslie, that answer your question?
And it'd be interesting to see how that transpires.
It will.
Just to say, Chair, the COVID cost estimated was about 1.3 million, and we're currently receiving a grant of 700,000 to the end of December. So most of the COVID costs should be being covered by additional grants.
Okay, thank you. I've just got one more speaker questioner before I think we close this, which is Lorraine. Can I hand over to you?
Thank you, Chairman. Barley, thank you so much. When I first met Andrea on my first day at Shire Hall, she will recall what I said to her, and that is the reason I ended up on this committee. So, Mr. Chairman, can we please, because I'm sick to death of asking this question and nothing gets done, it's never properly addressed, can we please have a look at bullying? I mentioned the other day in the last meeting a local case where a young child who has been being bullied from the moment he set foot in the secondary school finally defended himself. He's now been excluded. This is wrong. The schools are not dealing with it, and I would like it dealt with. Thank you.
Right, Andrea, we've got 2 more meetings left in this term of the council, I believe, one in January and one in March. Is that right? Do we have room in the March agenda to put bullying on the agenda?
Yes, we should do, Chair. I think before Councillor Patrick gets too carried away, I will contact doctors and get some background research on this, because obviously one of the challenges here is that we actually have no direct influence over a lot of the schools because they are academies. So
Yes.
It's a question of perhaps what might be the better way forward is for this committee to kind of maybe look at how a piece of work would be structured and then recommend that the committee in the new council, which is very quickly, then takes that work forward, maybe through a task group where it can actually then, do things in a much more detailed and focused way. I hope that's okay, Councillor Patrick.
All right, thank you, Andrea. Could you add that to the work plan and perhaps circulate it again for members of the committee? We're not formally bound to discuss the work plan today, and indeed we've run out of time, but that doesn't preclude an offline conversation by email. I think that concludes the meeting. I'd like to give my thanks to all the officers who have supported, to all the members who have paid great attention and asked questions. And I'll be seeing some of you tomorrow afternoon at corporate parenting, but to those who I won't see again this year, I wish you a safe Christmas. So thank you very much.